Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
In my youth, I had a wild streak. I was a teenager during the years when heavy metal began to get old. The group I ran with was fine with the classics, but they wanted something a little more extreme. We wanted something wild, raw, and unfiltered, and we found it in black metal. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm still a huge fan of black metal. It's nostalgic, and all these years later, I've never stopped enjoying it. I can even recommend some truly outstanding bands if you're interested. I can see why not everyone gets the appeal, but I stand by the genre. That said, in the early days, I won't deny that things did get a little bit out there, and I was part of that. At the time, some friends and I had arranged to spend a few months in Norway. The official story was that we were going to study abroad. The truth was, we just wanted to go to see some badass concerts. The best bands were still fairly underground. This was back during the days when Dead was still the frontman of Mayhem, and the scene was still wild, so there was a lot to see. There were a lot of bands creeping around the underbelly of the scene at that time. My friends and I all had different favorites, but mine was Lust. Lust's gimmick was that they had a female vocalist. In fact, most of the lineup was female, including the guitarist and bassist. The drummer was the only man. They were just kids, but man, oh man, did they know what they were doing. They really should have broken out and made it big time, but they didn't have that big of a fan base. Their concerts were so raw and aggressive. Their vocalist, Anna Male, seemed determined to sex up the entire black metal subculture as much as she possibly could. She'd come on stage half naked and strip off her clothes as she performed. She'd smear blood on her breasts and spit blood into the mouths of the two other girls on stage. Looking back on it, I suppose, I used to imagine I had a chance with her. I thought I was just crazy enough to make her fall for me, and I would have done anything she said. The guitarist, Rebecca Olstead, was no less interesting. She was nothing special in regards to the way she played, but she'd typically come out shirtless and wear a taxidermy goat's head. She was the image of Baphomet shrinking dark riffs on the stage, and the audience loved her for it. The head usually fell off halfway through the shows, but Rebecca had insisted it was a metaphor for Satan giving birth to sin through his forehead, and most fans ate that up. The collapse of the goat head was something of a special event at their concerts, and when it fell, the audience would always chant, "Sin! Sin! Sin! Sin!" Ida Wallen was the bassist. Unlike the vocalist and the guitarist, she had less of a gimmick. She typically dressed in all black and had stolen Dead's corpse paint long after he started using it. But that was all there was to her. Then there was the drummer, Thor Egeland. He wasn't the band's first drummer, more of an in-between piece. Their first drummer had been another woman, but supposedly she'd quit. They'd never bothered to replace Thor. He was barely just a kid, but he fit in just fine. We'd been staying in Oslo, but I'd been fine with traveling to try and catch Lust shows. I usually took a bus or caught a ride with a friend, so I could get as wasted as I wanted. The shows were mostly small affairs, little venues with nightly shows of various local bands. Black metal was still small at that time, but there were enough bands to keep a steady rotation going. I was drunk and had smoked most of a joint when I officially met the band. I'm not sure what the hell had gotten into my head, but I'd decided to wait out behind the venue for them after the show. I barely recognized them outside of their concert attire. Rebecca looked almost unrecognizable with her hair tied back and a black t-shirt on. I watched them bringing their equipment into an old van and stepped out to offer some help. I already knew that their English was pretty good, so I didn't bother fumbling my first impression with my butchered Norwegian. "Hey, you guys need a hand?" Anya looked up at me, a little surprised, before giving a nod. "Yeah, we'd appreciate it, thanks." She directed me to their amps, which I was more than happy to help carry. "I loved your show," I said. "I've been following you guys around for a while. You're great." "I'm glad to know someone's listening," Rebecca said. She stared at me intently for a few minutes. "I think I've seen you in the crowd before. You look familiar." "Thanks." It was all I could think of to say at the moment. When I'd helped them pack up, the inevitable offer for a beer came. They were just being polite. I saw that then, but I was more than happy to indulge. I'd been dreaming of hanging out with Lust for months, and it was basically a dream come true. We sat around their van, probably overdoing it with the booze and shooting the breeze, like we'd known each other for years. "So, are you coming to our show tomorrow night?" I remember Anya asking me. We'd ended up at a little bar a short ways down the road. It was after midnight and dead silent, but that was fine with us. Thor had left us to go and sleep in the van, so it was just myself, Anya, Rebecca, and Ida alone at the bar. "Yeah, I was planning on it," I said. "I know they'd be at a slightly larger show with a few more well-known bands." Nice. "Well, if you are, maybe you could ride in with us. We could use the help setting up. I'll make sure you're in the front. Maybe we can get a drink after. Sound good?" Her words slurred together a little bit. She was clearly drunk, but her proposition still sounded like the best idea I'd ever heard. "Yeah, hell yeah, that sounds great," I said. "Atta boy," Rebecca replied. "You got a car? You can ride in with us if you don't." Now that just sounded like a dream come true. "I caught a ride in with a friend, actually," I said. "He's probably waiting on me to give me a shout to pick me up, but honestly, I'd be down to ride with you guys for a bit." That was all it took to settle in. They couldn't really pay me for being their roadie, but I was just fine with that. They covered the drinks, and I got to go to a bunch of free shows. It wasn't just them I watched play. There were plenty of other bands. Most of them were small, but a few would go on to be considered synonymous with the rise of black metal. I just didn't see them either. I drank and got high with them. I saw Mayhem, and even hung out with Euronymous and Dead before the latter's suicide and the former's murder. It was awesome, and I got tales to tell, but those are for another day. Right now, I'm only here to talk about how it ended. I'd been traveling with Lust for almost 2 months at that point. During the week, we'd all go back to work, but come the weekend, it was the 5 of us in their little van, going between gigs. Rebecca seemed to manage the day-to-day of the band. Thor was just a kid along for the ride, just like I was, while Anya was in it for the thrills. Ida was the only one I never really got a read on. I'd chalk her up to being like Anya, in it for the thrill, but she and I never really talked much. I spent most of my time with Anya and Thor. They'd just finished a show, and I was helping Thor and Rebecca pack everything up for the night. We were already drunk, and Ida had wandered off somewhere else, although I didn't exactly know where. It didn't matter. We knew she'd be back. Sure enough, she was by the time Thor and I had finished. She wore a coy smile as she approached us, hands in her pocket. "We good to go?" she asked me. "Yep, we're all set," I replied. "Are we heading out or getting a drink?" "I was thinking it might be nice to get a drink," Ida said. "I was talking with one of the other bands. They mentioned there's an old stave church a few kilometers south of here. They headed over, so what do you think?" She grinned wildly from ear to ear. "Hell yes," Thor said. "Let's do it." Ida nodded, seeming to approve. Rebecca had joined us and was beginning to crack a smile. "Count me in," she said. "Should we bring gas?" "Yeah, we'll grab some on the way," Ida said. "I'll go get Anya, then we'll head out. I'll drive. I know where it is." In minutes, we headed towards the church. Thick black forest surrounded it, and I could see the outline ahead of us. It was one of those old Norwegian stave churches. They're a rarity these days, and it's damn lucky we didn't burn the lot of them. They're beautiful, don't get me wrong, but even more beautiful when set alight. "There's no one else here," Rebecca noted as we got closer. "We're probably just early," Ida said dismissively. "I'll just park. Let's get this party started." She was the first one out and went straight for the door of the church. She tried it, and when it didn't open, she called for a tire iron. Anya was more than happy to provide one, and we watched as Ida splintered the wood to let us inside. Thor and I carried the gasoline as we entered the old wooden church. "Look at this place," Ida murmured. "A house of lies." She beckoned to me. "Give me the gas." I handed the gas can I carried over to her and watched as Ida slowly poured the gasoline down onto the floor in a circle around her. Anya and Rebecca moved past her and toward the altar. They looked up at the figure of Christ on his cross before reaching up to tear it down. "Thor," Anya called, "come here. Let's bless this Savior." Thor came running, undoing his pants as he got closer. "You want to bless him too?" Rebecca asked. "I'll even give you bastards something to look at." She started to undo her top before pausing. "Someone's outside," Anya said. "The other band?" I asked, before heading to the door to peek out. There were no signs of another car, no immediate sign that anyone else was there but us. But when I saw them, I swore under my breath. 7 figures clad in black robes emerged from the forest. They advanced on the church slowly, and I pulled back inside. "There's some weirdos in robes," I whispered. Anya and Thor both looked to Rebecca for guidance. The desecrated cross fell to the ground. "Hide," Rebecca said, and we all did as we were told. I found a spot beside Anya. I saw Thor taking cover behind some of the pews, while Ida hid behind the altar. I didn't see where Rebecca went. For a few moments all was still. Then the robed figures entered the church, one at a time. They moved in a slow procession toward the altar before stopping in the aisle. I saw Thor pressed to the ground, trying to hide under the pew, although he still craned his neck to see what stood over him. Starting at the front of the line, the hooded figures began to disrobe. The black, formless shapes fell away, and beneath them I saw some of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen in my life. My breath caught in my throat as they stood in the darkness of the church, fully naked and exposed. "Get the boy," said one of the women in Norwegian. 2 of them broke rank and went for Thor. I watched as they dragged him from beneath the pews. Wait, let me go," he protested and tried to struggle. His pants were still partially undone, and I could have sworn I saw one of the women tugging them off of him. It took 4 women to drag Thor up to the altar. They dropped him in the circle of gasoline that Ida had made before holding him down. Thor looked around, panting heavily. The kid was clearly terrified. This was more than he'd bargained and signed up for. "Are your friends here?" asked one of the women. "No, I'm alone," Thor protested. "Are you?" the women replied and scoffed. She looked at the others around her. "We'll begin now," she said. We watched as Thor was stripped entirely. The women straddled him, rubbing his manhood and guiding him into her. His struggles weakened as he realized what was happening, and from the look in his face, he didn't seem to be enjoying it. The woman on top of him pinned his arms down as the other 6 women let Thor alone and began to walk in a circle around them. Their movements were rhythmic but stiff, almost like a strange dance. Slowly their voices rose together in unison in a chant I couldn't understand. I couldn't see Thor anymore, only heard him cry out before the women switched. Someone else held him down, and the one who just raped him took her place in the circle. "We have to stop this," Anya whispered to me. I looked at her and saw quiet horror on her face. It seemed almost foreign to her. "Can we?" I asked. "There's a lot of them, only 5 of us." "Even enough numbers," Anya said, and I felt her tensing as she prepared to go. But in the moment before she did, we watched as Ida rose up from behind the altar, her mouth moving in time with the eerie chant and her arms outstretched. "Sisters," she crooned as she finished her last stanza of the chant, "please have your fill of the boy. He is yours, as I promised you. Geidesvodel is upon us. Drink him, eat him." The women switched out again. I caught a brief look at Thor, and he looked downright terrified. Anya remained frozen beside me. Neither of us spoke the questions on our mind, but it was there all the same. One after the other, the 7 women took their turn with Thor. All the while their chant sounded quietly, and we watched in quiet horror, unable to run and too afraid to charge in. But once the women were done, things got even stranger. The women took a step back, and the gasoline Ida had poured was set alight. In the firelight, the women danced around Thor, who screamed out in terror. "Rise!" Ida crooned. "Rise, darling dearest! Rise! 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 Rise!" Women repeated back, and as they did, I heard Thor's scream turn from terror into agony. Through the flames I could see him writhing on the ground. I could see blood pouring out of his mouth and his eyes wide open in pain. Then came the ripping of flesh. Thor's screams reached a crescendo before they blacked out entirely. Then I saw the shape rising above the dancers. Too large to have been simply birthed from Thor's corpse, but as far as I could tell, that was exactly what had happened. It was pitch black and hard to make out amongst the flames, but what few details I could make out confirmed that it was covered in hair. I could see massive horns jutting out of its skull. "Yes!" Ida shrieked in pure elation, and the creature looked at her before letting out a goat-like bleat. The dancing women fell to their knees before it, and I was finally granted a look at the monster in all its terrible glory. It stood tall, with the head of a goat and the body of a man. Thick black hair covered the creature from head to toe, and it looked around, surveying the church. "No, no, no! Oh, my God! No!" The voice came out of nowhere, and from the shadows in the far corner of the church, I saw Rebecca moving. She bolted for the door, and the black goat set its sights on her. Letting out an enraged bleat, it leapt over the dancers and tackled her to the ground. All I heard was the sound of Rebecca's horrified screams as the black goat bit into her skull. Her head was crushed in its massive jaws, and her screaming was cut short. It was all that Anya and I needed to see. As the black goat finished with Rebecca, she bolted, running right for the door, and I ran behind her. The black goat looked up at us, cocking its head to the side, and as we escaped through the door of that church, I saw Ida grinning at us from the altar. "The car, get to the car," Anya murmured. She ran over to where we'd parked it before tugging at the door. It didn't open. No, 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 no! Of course, the door was locked. Ida had driven us over. Ida had the keys. The black goat bleated from inside the church, and we both looked back to see it standing in the doorway. Anya pressed herself against the car, petrified in fear, and as the black goat came for us, lurching forward and bleeding, I gave in to my fear and ran. Anya did not. I heard her cry out as the black goat fell upon her, and listened to the way she screamed as she was torn open. My legs pumped as hard as they could, putting as much distance between me and that monster as was humanly possible. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. I looked back only once to see if it was following me. All I saw was that the church was engulfed in flames behind me, and the shape of the black goat against the flames, far away and not in pursuit but still watching. It watched me until I was long gone. I heard that Ida died in the fire. I don't know if I believe that. It's been years since I followed lust, and since that horrible night, for the longest time, I had no idea what had happened. I didn't want to know. I just wanted it out of my memory for good. But you can't escape the worst things in life. I won't tell you where I heard about it. Demonology is a bit of a passion of mine, and always has been. More so ever since that night. But until now, I've never found an explanation for what I've seen. Most rituals are fake, made up either by superstitious folks or dumbasses. But every now and then you hear about something real. It has a name in Norwegian, but the translation means goat's birth, or the night of the goat. All the records I've found say it has never been successfully completed, but the steps match what I saw that night. On holy ground that has been defiled, 7 virgins must bed a single man. That man is then to be set ablaze, and as he burns, something will be summoned from the depths of hell, but it cannot survive the night unless it is properly bound. In order to be bound, it requires 4 sacrifices: body, mind, heart, and soul. Once it has received them, it is bound to the earth, undying, unfettered, unstoppable. Thor provided the sacrifice of body when he birthed that infernal thing. Rebecca's brain could count as mind. Anya was found outside the burnt remains of the church. Her chest had been torn open, and her heart had been consumed. But what of soul? What of soul indeed? Not a night goes by where I don't hear the terrible bleating of the black goat. I've had more nightmares than I can count. I've left the black metal scene behind, but the marks it has left on me will never go away. So tell me, what of soul?
One. A loud screeching noise interrupts my shower. Reaching for my towel, I hear it again, only louder. I get out of the shower and towel off quickly. Listening carefully, I don't hear the screech I heard earlier, and think to myself it must be nothing. Probably just bad plumbing in this older home. I put on my white jeans, the ones that fit just right. They go so well with the new aqua top I bought yesterday, laying on top of the bed. I am going to see my new guy friend that I met online. He looks so handsome, and his eyes make an electrical current pulse through me. We have a date to meet at the park, and I want to look my best. I've been friends with guys on the internet before, mostly chatting, but I have never gone to meet someone I found on the net. I finish dressing and I hear it again. A loud screeching noise, like claws upon the door, causing me to jump. I go to the stair railing and downstairs. I usually don't scare easily, but I am curious as to what that noise might be. I grab my jean jacket and quickly throw it on before descending the stairs that lead to the front hallway of our home. I stop. Go on down. Don't be a chicken. I heard something and I know I must check it out. What could it be? I open the front door. There is no one there. No scratches on the door. Nothing. I start to go back to my room to finish dressing. When I reach the top of the stairs, I hear it again. This time, I am sure something is there. A screeching, scratching noise, sounding like claws against metal. The back door, I think. That must be it. The back door that leads to the screened-in porch is metal. The screeching stopped as I make it halfway down the stairs. I pause and listen. I hear nothing. Silence. I take 2 more steps and freeze, straining to hear what I think is an animal scratching at the back door again. Suddenly, it gets louder. The sound isn't like a dog or even a cat. It's getting louder, and the screeching is sending chills down my spine. I make it to the bottom of the stairs and proceed carefully towards the back door. A loud crash, sounding like it came from the living room window being broken, makes me run instinctively for the back door. I open it to escape, but I can't. My internet date is standing in front of me, but something is terribly wrong. He shouldn't be here. How did he find me? He doesn't have hands. He has claws. He opens his mouth and bloody fangs and horns on his head appear as I stand frozen and in shock. His claws reach for my throat. Hello, Olivia. Darkness. 2. The light in the room woke me from my dream. I have this dream often, and there seems to be the same ending. Always a good-looking stranger I met on the internet dream comes to my house and tries to kill me. I always wake up not knowing the ending. Did he kill me? Did I kill the demon with the sharp claws reaching for my neck? I never seem to find out as the dream ends the same. Darkness. I get up and slide out of bed to make my coffee. Just out of curiosity, I check the front door. There are no footprints or scratches. I walk next to the back door, open it, and find nothing there showing anyone or anything has been near the house. I knew that would be so, but I check nonetheless. I grab my coffee and head to the couch. I open my laptop and log on. Today I will look for an internet date. It had been a year since Tom left me, and I was lonely and needed companionship. All this internet dating stuff is making me have these awful dreams. I quickly close the laptop and stop myself. Maybe it isn't meant for me to have someone else? I take a sip of my hot steaming coffee and ponder my thoughts. My phone rings and I see it as my friend Lauren calling. Hello, Lauren. Olivia, hi. I just found out there's a new bar in town opening this Friday night. I thought you may want to go. I don't know, Lauren. You know the guys you meet in bars. They are just out for one thing. Usually not looking for a long-term relationship. Well, Olivia, not to be critical, but when's the last time you've been with a man? Aren't you getting, well, needy? You mean horny, Lauren? Sure, sometimes, but not to the point I must throw myself at someone. I always thought that looked bad on most women. You know, throwing yourself at a man. Come on, Olivia, let's make a night of it. I'm not asking you to throw yourself at anyone. Besides, it's been a while since we did something fun together. Okay, I'll give in. Do you want me to drive? That's okay, Olivia. I'll drive myself, you know, just in case the man in my dreams shows up. Okay, to the new bar on Friday it is. I hang up the phone and laugh to myself at my friend Lauren. She had always been the adventurous one. Me, of course, the shy one. I took my relationships slow. Lauren was speedy and upfront. She knew what she wanted and was not afraid to ask. I, on the other hand, tend to take my time, freezing a relationship before it even gets started. Maybe this Friday will be different. We'll see. It's Thursday and I need to get dressed for work. I go upstairs and turn on the shower. The hot water is calming all the nerve endings that were stimulated far too much last night. I rinse my hair and turn towards the back of the shower. Through the steam, I see a face. What the hell? Tom's face? Just as quickly as she thought she saw her ex-husband, his face vanished into the steam. Tom? Hello, Olivia. I know I don't hear that. It can't be. Can it? I turn off the water and peek around the shower curtain. Barely open, I see nothing but the steam that has now gathered on my mirror. I grab my towel and begin to dry off. I would have to blow dry my hair, but today I decided to let it be curly. I didn't want to stay in here too long. The episode in the shower is giving me the creeps. I begin to wipe off the foggy mirror and reach down for the toothbrush and toothpaste, looking back up at the mirror. I jumped and lost my grip on both the toothbrush and tube of toothpaste. The claw, the one that reached for me in my dreams, was above my head. I scream out loud and duck, covering my head with both hands, waiting for my imminent demise. But there is nothing. I want to peek from my covered eyes, shut so tight it was giving me a headache. Do I dare? Slowly, I open a small gap between my index and middle finger. Nothing. I turn my head around and look upward. Nothing. I raise myself from a squatting position and look back into the mirror. Nothing. I must have something wrong with me. This crazy dream is consuming me. Damn that Tom. He's the cause of it all. I think too much about him. That's what it is. It's Tom giving me these bad dreams. The evil son of a bitch that he was. I shake my head and get back to finishing drying and putting on my clothes. Do I need therapy? I finish dressing and head to grab my purse and keys, head to the garage, and start the car after opening the garage door. I back out and close the door and head off to work. Driving down the road, I hear the voice again. Hello, Olivia. A chill goes down my spine. 3. I return home from work on Thursday and have a boring evening. Watching television and a cup of hot tea before bed isn't exactly killing it like we will be tomorrow going to the new club with Lauren. Lauren and I had an on-again, off-again relationship as friends, depending on if she was attached to a guy or not. When she was single, we hung out a lot. If she had a steady relationship, we saw each other very little. But even with all that, her love life and single life far outdistanced anything going on in mine. I had looked at dating sites often, but I couldn't get myself to jump into it, mainly because I kept having these bad dreams about online dating. Was it me, or was there really that many bad people out there? You hear it in the news all the time. It was hard to trust anyone after what Tom did. He ruined what I felt was the strongest love I ever felt for someone. The cheater brought his girlfriend to this house. I caught them here, in our home. I feel my face flush with heat at the memory of such a horrible set of circumstances. Whatever was on TV was now just a blur, and all of it came rushing back to me, causing me anger and tears. I hate myself for feeling this way. I must put this in the past. I promise myself tomorrow will be better and head up to my room. Friday night would be here soon, and I, Olivia Manson, will take control of my demons and have fun tomorrow at the new bar with Lauren. I toss and turn, unable to turn off the flow of thoughts consuming me. Damn that Tom. My parents were right, which I hate, but I should have never married him. They nagged me to no end about not marrying him until I couldn't take it any longer. I married him just to disappoint them. I wasn't going to let them control my life any longer, but in the end, they were right, and it was Tom, that damn Tom Manson, that shattered my world. I hear the shower running. I think I see Tom in my shower? And who's this woman under the sheets in my bed? What the fu— A loud screech causes Tom to turn off the shower. He wraps the towel around him and leaves the bathroom. What is that? The woman asks Tom. Stay here, I'm going to check it out. I'm going with you. the woman named Amy replied. "Don't go down there," I say aloud in my sleep as the dream continued. Tom makes it halfway down the stairs. The screeching noise gets louder. He stops halfway down the steps. Amy, the woman he cheated with, has a sheet wrapped around her and freezes. She starts to shake with fear. She had never heard such an awful sound. "The back door. It's coming from the back door," Tom whispers. "Don't go. Just call the police," Amy stammered. "It's probably just the dog." Tom continued down the steps and headed for the back door leading to the kitchen. "Don't open the door," I scream and sit straight up in bed. My nightgown is soaked with sweat and the fear inside of me doesn't want to know the end of the dream. I slowly get out of bed and make it to the bathroom. I lift the toilet seat and feel like I could hurl. But nothing comes, and I now hold on to the sink, keeping myself upright even though my legs are like jelly. I look up in the mirror. "Hello, Olivia." I close my eyes and needles, hot and piercing, feel like they are penetrating my skin all over my body. I shake my head. No, no, no. With the morning dream and bathroom episode behind me, I head to work. I am barely keeping myself together. My dreams, they are haunting me more each night. Lauren and I would have fun tonight, and maybe these dreams will vanish. Maybe I should cancel. Call Lauren and tell her I'm not feeling my best. No, I will go. I must pull myself together. Finally, Friday night has arrived. It's time to put this all behind me. I am trying to convince myself that dreams are just that. They mostly have no basis, but maybe only a slight reality of happening in your life sparks all the other fears inside of you. You wake up, and they disappear. I am ready to meet Lauren at the new bar. I take a deep breath, put my car in gear, and head to the new bar. 4. Lauren texted me and said she already had a place for us to sit. Naturally, she beat me there, as she was always the early bird. I enter the bar, and it's nicely decorated with modern taste, giving the appearance of a fun place to be. The atmosphere was all about something exciting tonight. The customers were buzzing, and a DJ is playing the thumping music. I see Lauren has a table for us already, and I tell the host I'm going to be with my friend as I point to Lauren. I walk ahead to meet Lauren. "Hey, Olivia, I'm so glad you came. It's so good to be out together again," Lauren said loudly over the blaring music, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "It's good to be here. I just hope we can hear each other over this music," Olivia countered. "Isn't this the best place? Surely we can find a nice guy in this place. It really seems popular," Lauren said. "It sure does," Olivia responded, looking to the left and noticing a handsome man staring at her from the long U-shaped bar to her left. Lauren noticed Olivia staring at the man. "Did you find one already?" Lauren quizzed Olivia. "Oh, he is cute, but I'm not quite settled in with you." "How was your week?" Olivia asked, turning away from the man at the bar. "Oh, dull. Work is work. But there is a new hire at the office that I really like. I told him we were coming here tonight. Maybe he will show up." "Oh, great. Just what I need. I don't want to be a third wheel. Not my idea of fun. Can Lauren just be my friend and not always have to be after every guy she meets? I was looking forward to some conversation. Guess that won't be happening." Suddenly, I snap out of my Debbie Downer thoughts, and there is a nice-looking guy at our table. "Olivia, this is Jiry Anderson. Jiry, this is my best friend Olivia." "Nice to meet you, Olivia. I've heard a lot about you from Lauren." "Nice to meet you as well," I offer back. Lauren and Jiry have a conversation about work, and my attention drifts back to the man at the bar. While I stare, Jiry and Lauren go to the dance floor, and I'm left alone. Oh well, third wheel I guess it is for tonight. The handsome man from the bar is walking towards me. Me, Olivia, the one with the fractured outlook on life. Me, the dud and third wheel. Hello, seems like your friends left you alone. Mind if I sit for a second? I came alone and I noticed you from the bar. Something stuck out to me about you. You just appear different than most people who hang out on a Friday. Seems to me you might need some good conversation. My name is Nathan Grissom, he said, holding his hand out to shake. I'm Olivia. That's my friend Lauren out there dancing with her new friend from work. So she left me here to fend for myself. Well, Olivia, you may have done better than ending up with me, but you could have done worse. Can I sit down? Sure, help yourself, I offered, noticing his neat haircut, kind facial features, and eyes. Oh, his eyes. They were beautiful. He lowers his tall and fit body to our table, and he looks directly into my eyes. I feel as I've seen you before. Not a pickup line. Just thinking I may know you from somewhere. You seem familiar, yet you are remarkably beautiful. I don't think I would have forgotten you, Nathan started. I blushed immediately, his eyes taking over. It was quite remarkable that his eyes were holding my attention like that. It was embarrassing. I recovered quickly. Well, thank you for that. I haven't been out too much lately. Lauren and I wanted to check out this new place tonight. To be honest, I haven't had much opportunity to date since my divorce. I'm sorry, Nathan answered as he looked away from Lauren and Jiry, then quickly returning his attention to me. Look, I must leave soon. I can only stay a few more minutes. I have to meet family. But can I see you again? I'd like to call and set up a real date, so maybe you can give me your number and I will call you and set up something for us. That is, if you want to. His eyes, those beautiful eyes, tell me he was sincere. So I write my number down for him. He takes the number and reaches his hand out to shake mine. I take his hand to consecrate the future date and notice how cold his hand was. Really cold, contradicting his warm and sexually attractive eyes. Ice cold. He smiles and turns to walk away. What in the hell did I just do? Jiry and Lauren come back from dancing and I am still in a trance about how cold his hand was. It didn't fit what his eyes were saying. I shake it off, and my evening continues with me being that third wheel I despised being when I hang out with Lauren. She had a guy, and I always went home alone. This night is going to be no different. I'm such a drip. 5. I get back home around 11 and quickly hang my coat on one of the hooks on the coat tree and head up the stairs. I can't quit thinking about Nathan. His eyes as hot as fire, and his hands, well, as cold as ice. Nathan also reminded me of someone, but I can't put my finger on it. Was it Tom? Shit, I certainly hope not. What a mistake Tom was. Married him because I loved him. He married me so he could cheat. I tried, but I just couldn't make it work. Tom, the cheating bastard. My eyes begin to tear up as I sit on my bed in my robe. My phone rings and I quickly answer it, not looking to see who it is. I assume it must be Lauren wanting to tell me about how wonderful Jiry, the new guy from work, was. But it wasn't Lauren's voice. Hello, Olivia. Who is this? I ask, not recognizing the voice immediately. It's Nathan, you know, from the bar tonight. Hello, Nathan. Sorry I didn't recognize the voice. I barely got to know you. That's why I called. I wanted to know if I could come by. I am finished with the family meeting and thought maybe we could talk more. I'd really like to get to know you better, Nathan said. Before I respond, I think to myself, no fucking way. But I relent and say yes. Those eyes, so pretty, but those hands, so cold. Sure, Nathan, sure, I say, getting over my Debbie Downer syndrome. Give me your address and I'll be there in just a few minutes, Olivia. I give him my address and wonder all the while, is this okay? It seems even more dangerous than internet dating sites. I must be going out on a limb here. What makes it okay for him to come here? I hang up and Nathan Grissom will be on his way soon. What did I just do? I hurried back upstairs to put on something casual, maybe just a bit seductive, but revealing enough to at least draw Nathan's interest. I do go slow, but there are times when, you just need someone to look at you in a different way. Nathan arrives in about a half an hour. I let him in and ask him if he'd like something to drink. He asked for a whiskey, and I poured myself a wine. We sit and chat for a while, and he begins to flirt with me. He moves closer to me and tries to kiss me. I give in to his handsome eyes as our lips are about to meet. His kiss is, well, not what I expected. His lips seem cool to me, not hot like I was hoping for. But I suggest we go upstairs to my room. I'm surprised I am moving this fast. For some reason, his eyes are controlling me, making me want him. We made love for quite some time and fell asleep in each other's arms. I woke later and slipped out of the covers, quietly heading downstairs. Nathan was good. Very good indeed. But aren't all the Nathans and Toms in the world the same? Love you for a while, cheat on you when they get tired of you, use you for what they want, but skip the emotional love and friendship, quit doing things for you, quit being considerate of your needs, quit fucking listening. I once again felt that old flash of heat, the flash my therapist wanted me to overcome. That fucking Tom. I grabbed the kitchen sink to keep myself from falling, my legs weakening with each hateful thought, but my upper body gaining a familiar strength. Nathan steps into the shower and feels the hot water soothe his cool skin. As he begins to wash himself, he hears a loud screeching noise. He stops and listens, but Nathan thinks it must be bad pipes. He finishes his shower and turns off the water. He hears it again. Another screech, this time louder than the next. He wraps a towel around him and heads for the landing outside of the bedroom. "Olivia! Hey, Olivia!" Nathan calls out. No answer. Another screech. The loudest of them all makes Nathan cringe. "Hey, Olivia! Where are you? Olivia!" No answer again. Nathan walks towards the back door and the scratching and screeching continues. Maybe Olivia is hurt. I need to check. A voice inside of my head is saying, "Please, Nathan, please don't open that door." Nathan reaches for the handle and turns it to open the door. "Nathan, do not open that door." A voice in person that Nathan cannot see or hear commands him. Too late. Nathan opens the door. I am standing there. "Hello, Nathan." Her strong right arm with claws attached to the end reach for Nathan's throat. He is stunned and shocked, not being able to move a muscle. Olivia lifts him off the ground and squeezes, puncturing his neck and causing blood to spatter all over. Nathan's face is bright red and finally his body goes limp and lifeless, collapsing to the ground. Darkness. I told him not to open the door. I tried, but he wouldn't listen. He would have just been another Tom. He would have cheated on me. I drag his body out to the old apple tree near the shed in my backyard. I retrieve the shovel from the shed and begin to dig. My thoughts excuse me for my actions. Just another Tom. Finally, the hole is finished, and I dumped the body next to where I laid cheating Tom to rest. I covered the hole and said, "You belong together." I put the shovel away and begin to walk back to the house. I clean up the rest of the blood and then go inside. I will get rid of his car and clothes in a while, I tell myself. Exhausted and my super strength leaving my body, I sit down. It's that fucking Tom. It's his fault. The phone rings and it's Lauren on the other line. Lauren begins blabbing about her date with Jiry, and I just listen, bored to tears. "What about your guy, the one you met at the bar tonight? Do you think you'll hear from him again?" Lauren asked. "I really doubt it," I say. I really doubt it.
The dust crunched beneath Bill's boots as he ran, heart pounding and sweat running down his face. The gunshot still rang out behind him. His gang was dead. He knew it. They didn't concern him, though. He could find more people to serve as his underlings. What concerned him was getting the hell away from that man. That weren't no man, he thought frantically as he almost tripped on a loose rock. That there was the devil. He knew that by all accounts his actions made him yellow, but living cowards were better than dead fools. If they was gonna try taking on the damn devil, serve 'em right, he reasoned. Making it to one of the unoccupied homes, Bill quickly entered, opening his pack, and began hastily shoveling as much food as he could fit. At least there were fewer mouths to feed now. Once he shoved enough into the saddlebags, he mounted his horse and began riding away. While he rode, he heard the deep cackle of the stranger behind him before he called out.
Run all you like, Billy boy. I'll find you.
He only rode faster. 3 days passed and he kept riding. He didn't stop, not for food, not for water, not for sleep. He cursed the distance of Angel's Pit from civilization, ignoring the fact that he had chosen it as a hideout for that very reason. He didn't think about that now, though. What was important was that he found somewhere to hide. He needed to get somewhere to lie low before the stranger's gray horse appeared over the horizon. Even before his gang had started shooting, he knew something was off. The stranger, face covered in burns, had come from nowhere, trotting into the abandoned town, Angel's Pit, as if he owned the place. As the Oakley gang, a group of 15 bandits aimed their guns at the man on the ashy gray horse, he stepped down and held his hands up. Now, gentlemen, he said in a voice dry and hoarse as a lifelong smoker. I didn't come here for no shootout. Even as his hands were up, he smiled. Who in the hell are you? What's your business here? Demanded Bill, seeming mildly perturbed by the grinning intruder. Chuckling, he replied. Call me what you like. As for what my business is... He paused as if trying to find the right words. Call it collection. Well, you done picked the wrong place for collecting, mister, Bill replied with only the swaggering confidence a bandit leader could. I don't rightly know what you was hoping to collect, but anything worth having is... Calm yourselves now. I didn't come here for no money. And I didn't come here for no food either. Puzzled, Bill approached the stranger, his revolver still aimed at him. Why then? Who sent you? You a lawman? Bounty hunter? Tapping his chin, the stranger hummed thoughtfully. You could say the latter, but you still wouldn't be quite on the mark there, William Abernathy. Everyone noticed when their leader froze. His voice now came out in a slow stutter. How in the hell do you know that name? Not even his gang knew his true family name, instead addressing him as Red Bill Oakley. I know plenty of things about you, Billy boy, the stranger said, his grin widening, looking more grotesque with his burns. I know that you was one of them slave catchers back when that shit was still legal. Brought a bunch of escaped folks back from the north. Put 'em back to work on your pa's plantation. Some of them were conveniently enough. His grin lowered into a hateful sneer, and his voice became a disdainful hiss. Damaged upon arrival. Beaten, bones broken, missing limbs. Wouldn't stop bad-mouthing you and your pa. Couldn't even be sewed off. Couldn't put the irons on them, so you had to put lead in them, yeah? Even Abigail, especially Abigail. All 'cause your dear little brother Jack loved her. The rage at which he spoke her name caused Bill's face to drain of all his bravado. He gazed at the stranger with the terror of a man facing the gallows as the memories of Abigail flooded back. The pleas of her mother to kill her instead. The callous slap he gave the woman. The shot. The wails that only a grieving mother could make. The horrified, betrayed screams of Jack. Tears fell from his eyes, but not because he felt remorse for the life he had lived. It was the fact that this stranger knew everything about it. That ghastly smile split the stranger's face again at Bill's fear. I hit the nail on the head, didn't I, Billy boy? The revolver shook in Bill's hand, lowering slowly, and his gang looked upon him with a mix of shock, disgust, and terror at the stranger. As if he could sense their shock, he turned his head towards one of the bandits, a red-headed man. Oh, don't act like you're so innocent over there, Johnny. Remember how you stole Daddy's gun when you were 15? Shot your little brother for stealing sweets from you? He turned his head to another man in the group, a 24-year-old man with a full beard. Or you, Bert, when you left your pa to die in a fire you started over an inheritance you spent on drinking and whoring. Then joining these pricks when it ran dry? Same goes for all of you. Birds of a feather and all that. I could go on, but I didn't come here for judging. That's someone else's business. As I said, I came here for collecting. Bill felt the cold, dead eyes before he saw him. Mistaking the stranger's intentions, he said, You can have Benny over there. Never really liked him. He gestured at one of the younger bandits, who looked at his once trusted leader with shock and betrayal on his face. However, the stranger's teeth just glinted in the moonlight as his grin widened further. He threw his head back and laughed much too hard for anyone under these circumstances. So much so that Bill winced in surprise. Ain't very bright, are you, Billy boy? This here ain't no matter of sacrifice. I said, I came here to collect. He emphasized the last word, looking directly at Bill, then the rest of the gang. The leader caught on, as did the others. Any volunteers? The stranger asked, half rhetorically. A rifle shot caused Bill to jump as one of the other bandits, Cole, fired upon the stranger, the round hitting him square in the chest. Blood began to spread under the surface of the duster. Then, to the horror of the entire gang, he looked up and grinned at Cole like a fox cornering a hen. We have a winner. Without hesitation, his hand shot like a rattlesnake for his holster, then drew his revolver. In the moonlight, the engraving on the weapon shone, revealing itself to be a snarling wolf. He fired, leaving a vermilion smear on the rocks behind them. The rest of the Oakley gang ran for cover, then began firing at the stranger. All they did, however, was create new targets. When 5 more of the gang lay dead on the desert ground, the remainders continued firing wildly, letting their desperation and fear snuff out their better judgment. Casually, even as round after round hit him, the stranger opened the cylinder for his gun, then dropped a bullet in each chamber before turning to the rest of them. After reloading, he began firing at each man who fired first. None noticed that their leader Bill had escaped into the night. They kept shooting, but he didn't flinch no matter how many bullets entered his body. Soon he finished his bloody work. Once that had been done, he had crossed out the names on the piece of paper given to him by the broker. All that was left was William Abernathy. His ears picked up the faint sound of hooves fleeing the hideout, and he smiled. So the vermin wanted a chase, did he? Fine by him. These others had served as little more than entertainment, appetizers in a sense.
Run all you like, Billy boy! I'll find you!
He yelled into the desert. He mounted his horse, then began a patient trot after his prey. Bill kept urging his horse, but the beast's steps were slowing down, and its breathing was labored. The escape had exhausted the poor horse, who stumbled and toppled to the ground. In a mix of frustration and hysteria, he leapt from the saddle, then shot the animal between his eyes. Grabbing whatever supplies he could from the saddlebags, he began looking around wildly for somewhere, anywhere to hide. His legs propelled him by otherworldly terror. He ran ahead, then was overcome with joy and relief. A cave. Unable to believe his luck, he quickly got inside. He began rummaging through the saddlebags. A horrified gasp escaped his lips as he realized his error. There was food, but the bags contained no water, and there was very little money that he could use when he got to the next town, and only a few boxes of ammunition. Not that the last part mattered, as he had only brought the one revolver in his panic. He slumped against the wall of the cave. Bill knew he was done for. It didn't matter if the stranger found him or not. He was dead anyway. As if on cue, he heard the hooves. Suddenly, inexplicably, his fear was overwhelmed by rage. It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. He was Red Bill Oakley, one of the greatest outlaws Texas had ever known. When they passed through towns, the bartenders in the saloons would offer them free drinks in exchange for sparing them. Townsfolk would throw money at his feet if he so much as looked at them. They would be given residence in any inn or house, free of charge, just for letting the occupants live. Sometimes they spared them. Sometimes they shot or robbed the occupants anyway, even burned the residences to the ground just for fun. People respected them because they were afraid of him, afraid that their town might become the next Angel's Pit. And in one night, this stranger had walked into the home he had rightfully stolen, killed his entire gang, and was now chasing him. "For what?" he seethed. "Abigail would have taken Jack with her, the little harlot." Seeming to forget or not care that his gang's bullets had done no harm to the stranger, he cocked back the hammer on his revolver as the hooves got closer. As soon as it was about to round the edge of the cave's mouth, He ran out, aiming the gun and letting out a vicious shout, which died on his lips. The horse was there all right, but there was no rider. As the bewildered Bill tried to make sense of all this, he heard a short whistle behind him. Slowly, almost as if he were being controlled by some outside force, he turned. In the back of the cave was the stranger, grinning and shoulders shaking lightly from his chuckling, like a child who had been hiding and waiting to jump out and scare someone. Bill recoiled and screamed with enough terror to wake the dead, then hastily aimed his pistol and fired once, twice, 3 times. This was followed by 2 more before a hollow click signaled that the gun was empty. Bill whimpered as he remembered that he had used a round to kill his steed. As the uninjured stranger exited the cave, Bill stumbled and fell, scooting back frantically.
Please,
he stammered, rage forgotten and once again overwhelmed by terror.
Please, let me go.
We both know I can't do that, Billy boy,
the stranger said with a falsely sympathetic expression. Bill tried to scramble away, but the stranger's hand clasped around his throat and slammed him against a large rock. His strength was unnatural, especially for someone so thin.
You still haven't recognized me, have you?
He asked, sounding almost disappointed as he began tying them up.
Should I?
Bill asked. Placing a hand over his heart, the stranger feigned offense. When he spoke next, his voice seemed to become less gravelly, sounding younger as well.
Well, I'm wounded. I thought for sure you would have recognized your own flesh and blood, Billy boy.
There was a moment of silence as he registered the voice. Now that he was speaking that way, though, there was no mistaking it. He had seen those burns when his father's killer was hanged.
Jack?
The stranger's face morphed into the same sneer he held when he mentioned Abigail. He kicked Bill in the ribs, driving the wind out of him.
Goddamn straight, you little shit,
he growled, his voice returning to the previous gravelly voice. Bill squirmed on the ground, groaning in pain and pulling at the bindings.
Why?
Why?
Jack repeated in a mocking falsetto, then cruelly kicked him again.
You know goddamn well why.
The memory of Abigail came to Bill's memory.
Then that was why you burned Paul's plantation when you got home from the war?
Bill asked, his tone accusatory, despite his fear and pain.
Why you killed Pa?
I killed Pa for everything he did to those folks. He treated them like animals on the best of days, remember?
Bill shook his head, either in disbelief or in denial. He then reached down and began rummaging through Bill's pockets, seeming to be looking for something. Eventually, he found it. Their mother's engagement ring, which he had planned to give to Abigail before her death. For the first time, an expression besides cruel glee or anger crossed his face. His face fell, and Jack clutched the ring in his fist, as if it would somehow bring back the woman he was about to offer it to. His memories were interrupted by Bill, and he was almost glad for it. He was never able to deal with grief well. Anger was much easier to express, especially so because Bill, the man he once called his brother, was laughing bitterly,
That's all you wanted?
He cried out as he kept laughing, the sheer ludicrousness of the situation almost breaking his mind.
Ma's ring? You killed my gang, ruined my reputation, chased me all the way out here in the desert for that ring?
Oh, no, Bill.
Jack replied coldly, beginning to draw some strange symbols on the ground as the laughter continued.
I told you before, I was here to collect. Thing is, I'm here on someone else's behalf.
Bill's laughter gradually faded as he noticed the symbols making a circle around him.
Jack?
He asked uncertainly.
What are...
The symbols glowed scarlet, and suddenly, with a flash of red, they were joined by a third stranger. A tall, clean-shaven man without a bead of sweat on his skin despite the desert heat. The well-dressed stranger looked down from his place on a large white horse. It was the broker. He examined Bill with an appraising look, as if he were a merchant determining the value of a potentially valuable object. He turned to Jack and asked, "So, is this the soul, then?"
Don't see anyone else round, do you?
Jack said sardonically. "Merely a formality," replied the broker coolly. Bill looked back and forth from the man to Jack. Then it all fell into place.
Jack, you can't be...
I am, Bill,
Jack replied venomously.
You sent me to hell when you killed her. The gallows just finished the job. Except you won't be getting the luxury that your friends and me did. We at least had a little moment of darkness and silence when we died, just before the fire came. But you... you ain't getting off so easy. You'll be going to hell alive first.
Tears began to run down Bill's cheek.
No! Jack, please! I'm so sorry!
He blubbered pathetically. Ignoring his brother's tears, crocodilian or not, Jack handed the list to the stranger, who gave him an envelope, then gave a brief whistle as if calling a dog.
Come on, boys,
the broker exclaimed.
Supper time!
Without warning, the symbols glowed again, and the head of a snarling black canine shot up from the ground where Bill was lying and sunk its teeth into his arm, accompanied by many more. He screamed and struggled and begged and cursed, but Jack just watched as Bill was dragged by the hounds.
So long, Billy boy,
he said mockingly.
Don't forget to say hi to Pa for me, you hear?
The last sight Bill saw of the earth was of his own brother grinning as he entered the inferno. When it was done, the broker whistled, seemingly in amazement.
I'm beginning to understand what the client sees in you, Jack, he remarked.
You are a ruthless one, aren't you?
The bounty, please,
Jack said curtly. The broker simply nodded and pulled out an envelope which he handed to Jack. He then tipped his hat, then rode away, vanishing into thin air. Jack opened the envelope. The paper inside showed the names of the bandits, along with numbers next to them, the worth of their souls due to their evil deeds. At the bottom it read, remaining number of souls required for redemption, 72. He sighed, then put away the paper. It wasn't much, but it got him closer to his goal. He held the ring in his hand again. For the first time in years, he gave a small, genuine smile as tears welled up in his eyes, drying them quickly as if he was worried to be caught crying. He tucked the ring into his coat, then mounted his horse and rode off into the desert to await his next contract. He didn't think he trusted the client all too well. Only fools did. But all the same, if there was even a sliver of hope of seeing his beloved Abigail again, he would take it. Until then, he would paint the entire West red if need be.
West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically, and where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glint of sunlight. On the gentle slopes there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat, moss-coated cottages brooding eternally over old New England secrets in the lee of great ledges. But these are all vacant now, the wide chimneys crumbling and the shingled sides bulging perilously beneath low, gambrel roofs. The old folk have gone away, and foreigners do not like to live there. French Canadians have tried it, Italians have tried it, and the Poles have come and departed. It is not because of anything that can be seen or heard or handled, but because of something that can be imagined. The place is not good for imagination, and does not bring restful dreams at night. It must be this which keeps the foreigners away, for old Ammy Pierce has never told them of anything he recalls from the strange days. Ammy, whose head has been a little queer for years, is the only one who still remains, or who ever talks of the strange days. And he dares to do this because his house is so near the open fields and the traveled roads around Arkham. There was once a road over the hills and through the valleys that ran straight where the blasted heath is now, but people ceased to use it, and a new road was laid curving far toward the south. Traces of the old one can still be found amidst the weeds of a returning wilderness, and some of them will doubtless linger, even when half the hollows are flooded for the new reservoir. Then, the dark woods will be cut down, and the blasted heath will slumber far below blue waters whose surface will mirror the sky and ripple in the sun. And the secrets of the strange days will be one with the deep's secrets, one with the hidden lore of old ocean, and all the mystery of primal earth. When I went into the hills and vales to survey for the new reservoir, they told me the place was evil. They told me this in Arkham, and because that is a very old town full of witch legends, I thought the evil must be something which grandmas had whispered to children through centuries. The name, Blasted Heath, seemed to me very odd and theatrical, and I wondered how it had come into the folklore of a Puritan people. Then, I saw that dark, westward tangle of glens and slopes for myself, and ceased to wonder at anything besides its own elder mystery. It was morning when I saw it, but the shadow lurked always there. The trees grew too thickly, and their trunks were too big for any healthy New England wood. There was too much silence in the dim alleys between them, and the floor was too soft with the dank moss and mattings of infinite years of decay. In the open spaces, mostly along the line of the old road, there were little hillside farms, sometimes with all the buildings standing, sometimes with only one or two, and sometimes with only a lone chimney or fast-filling cellar. Weeds and briars reigned, and furtive wild things rustled in the undergrowth. Upon everything was a haze of restlessness and oppression, a touch of the unreal and the grotesque, as if some vital element of perspective or chiaroscuro were awry. I did not wonder that the foreigners would not stay, for this was no region to sleep in. It was too much like a landscape of Salvador Rosa, too much like some forbidden woodcut in a tale of terror. But even all this was not so bad as the blasted heath. I knew it the moment I came upon it at the bottom of a spacious valley, for no other name could fit such a thing, or any other thing fit such a name. It was as if the poet had coined the phrase from having seen this one particular region. It must, I thought as I viewed it, be the outcome of a fire. But why had nothing new ever grown over these 5 acres of gray desolation that sprawled open to the sky, like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields? It lay largely to the north of the ancient road line, but encroached a little on the other side. I felt an odd reluctance about approaching, and did so at last only because my business took me through and past it. There was no vegetation of any kind on the broad expanse, but only a fine gray dust or ash, which no wind seemed ever to blow about. The trees near it were sickly and stunted, and many dead trunks stood or lay rotting at the rim. As I walked hurriedly by, I saw the tumbled bricks and stones of an old chimney and cellar on my right, and the yawning black maw of an abandoned well, whose stagnant vapors played strange tricks with the hues of the sunlight. Even the long, dark woodland climb beyond seemed welcome in contrast, and I marveled no more at the frightened whispers of Arkham people. There had been no house or ruin near. Even in the old days, the place must have been lonely and remote, and at twilight, dreading to repass that ominous spot, I walked circuitously back to the town by the curious road on the south. I vaguely wished some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the deep, skyey voids above had crept into my soul. In the evening, I asked old people in Arkham about the blasted heath, and what was meant by that phrase, strange days, which so many evasively muttered. I could not, however, get any good answers except that all the mystery was much more recent than I had dreamt. It was not a matter of old legendary at all, but something within the lifetime of those who spoke. It had happened in the 80s, and a family had disappeared or was killed. Speakers would not be exact, and because they all told me to pay no attention to old Ammy Pierce's crazy tales, I sought him out the next morning, having heard that he lived alone in the ancient, tottering cottage where the trees first begin to get very thick. It was a fearsomely ancient place, and had begun to exude the faint miasmal odor which clings about houses that have stood too long. Only with persistent knocking could I rouse the aged man, and when he shuffled timidly to the door, could tell he was not glad to see me. He was not so feeble as I had expected, but his eyes drooped in a curious way, and his unkempt clothing and white beard made him seem very worn and dismal. Not knowing just how he could best be launched on his tales, I feigned a matter of business, told him of my surveying, and asked vague questions about the district. He was far brighter and more educated than I had been led to think, and before I knew it, had grasped quite as much of the subject as any man I had talked with in Arkham. He was not like other rustics I had known in the sections where reservoirs were to be. From him, there were no protests at the miles of old wood and farmland to be blotted out, though perhaps there would have been had not his home lain outside the bounds of the future lake. Relief was all that he showed, relief at the doom of the dark, ancient valleys through which he had roamed all his life. They were better underwater now, better underwater since the strange days, and with this opening, his husky voice sank low, while his body leaned forward, and his right forefinger began to point shakily and impressively. It was then that I heard the story, and as the rambling voice scraped and whispered on, I shivered again and again spite the summer day. Often, I had to recall the speaker from ramblings, piece out scientific points which he knew only by a fading parrot memory of professors' talk, or bridge over gaps where his sense of logic and continuity broke down. When he was done, I did not wonder that his mind had snapped a trifle, or that the folk of Arkham would not speak much of the blasted heath. I hurried back before sunset to my hotel, unwilling to have the stars come out above me in the open, and the next day returned to Boston to give up my position. I could not go into that dim chaos of old forest and slope again, or face another time that gray blasted heath where the black well yawned deep beside the tumbled bricks and stones. The reservoir will soon be built now, and all those elder secrets will be safe forever under watery fathoms. But even then, I do not believe I would like to visit that country by night. At least not when the sinister stars are out, and nothing could bribe me to drink the new city water of Arkham. It all began, old Amy said, with a meteorite. Before that time there had been no wild legends at all since the witch trials, and even then these western woods were not feared half so much as the small island in the Miskatonic, where the devil held court beside a curious lone altar, older than the Indians. These were not haunted woods, and their fantastic dusk was never terrible till the strange days. Then there had come that white noontide cloud, that string of explosions in the air, and that pillar of smoke from the valley far in the wood. And by night all Arkham had heard of the great rock that fell out of the sky and bedded itself in the ground beside the well at the Nahum Gardner place. That was the house which had stood where the blasted heath was to come, the trim, white Nahum Gardner house, amidst its fertile gardens and orchards. Nahum had come to town to tell people about the stone, and dropped in at Amy Pierce's on the way. Amy was 40 then, and all the queer things were fixed very strongly in his mind. He and his wife had gone with the 3 professors from Miskatonic University, who hastened out the next morning to see the weird visitor from unknown stellar space, and had wondered why Nahum had called it so large the day before. It had shrunk, Nahum said, as he pointed out the big brownish mound above the ripped earth and charred grass near the archaic well sweep in his front yard. But the wise men answered that stones do not shrink. Its heat lingered persistently, and Nahum declared it had glowed faintly in the night. The professors tried it with the geologist's hammer and found it was oddly soft. It was, in truth, so soft as to be almost plastic, and they gouged rather than chipped a specimen to take back to the college for testing. They took it in an old pail borrowed from Nahum's kitchen, for even the small piece refused to grow cool. On the trip back, they stopped at Amy's to rest, and seemed thoughtful when Mrs. Pierce remarked that the fragment was growing smaller and burning the bottom of the pail. Truly, it was not large, but perhaps they had taken less than they thought. The day after that, all this was in June of '82, the professors had trooped out again in great excitement. As they passed Amy's, they told him what queer things the specimen had done, and how it had faded wholly away when they put it in a glass beaker. The beaker had gone too, and the wise men talked of the strange stone's affinity for silicon. It had acted quite unbelievably in that well-ordered laboratory, doing nothing at all, and showing no occluded gases when heated on charcoal, being wholly negative in the borax bead, and soon proving itself absolutely non-volatile at any producible temperature, including that of the oxyhydrogen blowpipe. On an anvil it appeared highly malleable, and in the dark its luminosity was very marked. Stubbornly refusing to grow cool, it soon had the college in a state of real excitement, and when, upon heating before the spectroscope, it displayed shining bands unlike any known colors of the normal spectrum, there was much breathless talk of new elements, bizarre optical properties, and other things which puzzled men of science are wont to say when faced by the unknown. Hot as it was, they tested it in a crucible with all the proper reagents. Water did nothing. Hydrochloric acid was the same. Nitric acid and even aqua regia merely hissed and spattered against its torrid invulnerability. Amy had difficulty in recalling all these things, but recognized some solvents as I mentioned them in the usual order of use. There were ammonia and caustic soda, alcohol and ether, nauseous carbon disulfide, and a dozen others. But, although the weight grew steadily less as time passed, and the fragments seemed to be slightly cooling, there was no change in the solvents to show that they had attacked the substance at all. It was a metal, though, beyond a doubt. It was magnetic for one thing, and after its immersion in the acid solvents there seemed to be the faint traces of the Widmedstatten figures found on meteoric iron. When the cooling had grown very considerable, the testing was carried on in glass, and it was in a glass beaker that they left the chips made of the original fragment during the work. The next morning, both chips and beaker were gone without a trace, and only a charred spot marked the place on the wooden shelf where they had been. All this the professors told Amy as they paused at his door, and once more he went with them to see the stony messenger from the stars, though this time his wife did not accompany him. It had now most certainly shrunk, and even the sober professors could not doubt the truth of what they saw. All around the dwindling brown lump near the well was a vacant space, except where the earth had caved in, and whereas it had been a good 7 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 5. It was still hot, and the sages studied its surface curiously as they detached another and larger piece with hammer and chisel. They gouged deeply this time, and as they pried away the smaller mass, they saw that the core of the thing was not quite homogeneous. They had uncovered what seemed to be the side of a large colored globule embedded in the substance. The color, which resembled some of the bands in the meteor's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe, and it was only by analogy that they called it color at all. Its texture was glossy, and upon tapping it appeared to promise both brittleness and hollowness. One of the professors gave it a smart blow with a hammer, and it burst with a nervous little pop. Nothing was emitted, and all trace of the thing vanished with the puncturing. It left behind a hollow, spherical space, about 3 inches across, and all thought it probable that others would be discovered as the enclosing substance wasted away. Conjecture was vain, so, after a futile attempt to find additional globules by drilling, the seekers left again with their new specimen, which proved, however, as baffling in the laboratory as its predecessor. Aside from being almost plastic, having heat, magnetism, and slight luminosity, cooling slightly in powerful acids, possessing an unknown spectrum, wasting away in air and attacking silicon compounds with mutual destruction as a result, it presented no identifying features whatsoever, and at the end of the tests, the college scientists were forced to own that they could not place it. It was nothing of this earth, but a piece of the great outside, and as such dowered with outside properties, and obedient to outside laws. That night there was a thunderstorm, and when the professors went out to Nahum's the next day, they were met with bitter disappointment. The stone, magnetic as it had been, must have had some peculiar electrical property, for it had drawn the lightning, as Nahum said, with a singular persistence. 6 times within an hour the farmer saw the lightning strike the furrow in the front yard, and when the storm was over, nothing remained but a ragged pit by the ancient well sweep, half choked with a caved-in earth. Digging had borne no fruit, and the scientists verified the fact of the utter vanishment. The failure was total, so that nothing was left to do but go back to the laboratory and test again the disappearing fragment left carefully cased in lead. The fragment lasted a week, at the end of which nothing of value had been learned of it. When it was gone, no residue was left behind, and in time the professors felt scarcely sure they had indeed seen with waking eyes that cryptic vestige of the fathomless gulfs outside. That lone, weird message from other universes and other realms of matter, force, and entity. As was natural, the Arkham papers made much of the incident with its collegiate sponsoring and sent reporters to talk with Nahum Gardner and his family. At least one Boston daily also sent a scribe, and Nahum quickly became a kind of local celebrity. He was a lean, genial person of about 50, living with his wife and 3 sons on the pleasant farmstead in the valley. He and Amy exchanged visits frequently, as did their wives, and Amy had nothing but praise for him after all these years. He seemed slightly proud of the notice his place had attracted, and talked often of the meteorite in the succeeding weeks. That July and August were hot, and Nahum worked hard at his haying in the 10-acre pasture across Chapman's Brook, his rattling wain wearing deep ruts in the shadowy lanes between. The labor tired him more than it had in other years, and he felt that age was beginning to tell on him. Then fell the time of fruit and harvest. The pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchards were prospering as never before. The fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwonted gloss, and in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the future crop. But with the ripening came sour disappointment, for of all that gorgeous array of specious lusciousness, not one single jot was fit to eat. Into the fine flavor of the pears and apples had crept a stealthy bitterness and sickishness, so that even the smallest bites induced a lasting disgust. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw that his entire crop was lost. Quick to connect events, he declared that the meteorite had poisoned the soil, and thanked heaven that most of the other crops were in the upland lot along the road. Winter came early, and was very cold. Amy saw Nahum less often than usual, and observed that he had begun to look worried. The rest of his family, too, seemed to have grown taciturn, and were far from steady in their church-going or their attendance at the various social events of the countryside. For this reserve or melancholy no cause could be found, though all the household confessed now and then to poorer health and a feeling of vague disquiet. Nahum himself gave the most definite statement of anyone when he said he was disturbed about certain footprints in the snow. They were the usual winter prints of red squirrels, white rabbits, and foxes, but the brooding farmer professed to see something not quite right about their nature and arrangement. He was never specific, but appeared to think they were not as characteristic of the anatomy of habits of squirrels and rabbits and foxes as they ought to be. Amy listened without interest to this talk until one night, when he drove past Nahum's house in his sleigh on the way back from Clark's Corner. There had been a moon, and a rabbit had run across the road, and the leaps of that rabbit were longer than either Amy or his horse liked. The latter, indeed, had almost run away when brought up by a firm rein. Thereafter, Amy gave Nahum's tales more respect, and wondered why the Gardner dog seemed so cowed and quivering every morning. They had, it developed, nearly lost the spirit to bark. In February, the McGregor boys from Meadow Hill were out shooting woodchucks, and not far from the Gardner place bagged a very peculiar specimen. The proportion of its body seemed slightly altered in a queer way impossible to describe, while its face had taken on an expression which no one ever saw in a woodchuck before. The boys were genuinely frightened and threw the thing away at once, so that only their grotesque tales of it ever reached the people of the countryside. But the shying horses near Nahum's house had now become an acknowledged thing, and all the basis for a cycle of whispered legend was fast taking form. People vowed that the snow melted faster around Nahum's than it did anywhere else, and early in March there was an awed discussion in Potter's General Store at Clark's Corners. Stephen Rice had driven past Gardner's in the morning and had noticed the skunk cabbages coming up through the mud by the woods across the road. Never were things of such size seen before, and they held strange colors that could not be put into any words. Their shapes were monstrous, and the horse had snorted at an odor which struck Stephen as wholly unprecedented. That afternoon, several persons drove past to see the abnormal growth, and all agreed that plants of that kind ought never to sprout in a healthy world. The bad fruit of the fall before was freely mentioned, and it went from mouth to mouth that there was poison in Nahum's ground. Of course it was the meteorite, and remembering how strange the men from the college had found that stone to be, several farmers spoke about the matter to them. One day, they paid Nahum a visit, but having no love of wild tales and folklore, were very conservative in what they inferred. The plants were certainly odd, but all skunk cabbages are more or less odd in shape and hue. Perhaps some mineral element from the stone had entered the soil, but it would soon be washed away. And as for the footprints and frightened horses, of course this was mere country talk, which such a phenomenon as the aerolite would be certain to start. There was really nothing for serious men to do in cases of wild gossip, for superstitious rustics will say and believe anything. And so, all through the strange days the professors stayed away in contempt. Only one of them, when given 2 files of dust for analysis in a police job over a year and a half later, recalled that the queer color of that skunk cabbage had been very like one of the anomalous bands of light shown by the meteor fragment in the college spectroscope, and like the brittle globule found embedded in the stone from the abyss. The samples in this analysis case gave the same odd bands at first, though later they lost the property. The trees budded prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they swayed ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son Thaddeus, a lad of 15, swore that they swayed also when there was no wind, but even the gossips would not credit this. Certainly, however, restlessness was in the air. The entire Gardner family developed the habit of stealthily listening, though not for any sound which they could consciously name. The listening was indeed rather a product of moments when consciousness seemed half to slip away. Unfortunately, such moments increased week by week, till it became common speech that something was wrong with all Nahum's folks. When the early saxifrage came out, it had another strange color, not quite like that of the skunk cabbage, but plainly related and equally unknown to anyone who saw it. Nahum took some blossoms to Arkham and showed them to the editor of the Gazette, but that dignitary did not more than write a humorous article about them, in which the dark fears of rustics were held up to polite ridicule. It was a mistake of Nahum's to tell a stolid city man about the way the great, overgrown morning-cloak butterflies behaved in connection with these saxifrages. April brought a kind of madness to the country folk, and began that disuse of the road past Nahum's which led to its ultimate abandonment. It was the vegetation. All the orchard trees blossomed forth in strange colors, and through the stony soil of the yard and adjacent pasturage there sprang up a bizarre growth which only a botanist could connect with the proper flora of the region. No sane, wholesome colors were anywhere to be seen except in the green grass and leafage, but everywhere were those hectic and prismatic variants of some diseased underlying primary tone, without a place among the known tints of earth. The Dutchman's breeches became a thing of sinister menace, and the bloodroots grew insolent in their chromatic perversion. Amy and the gardeners thought that most of the colors had a sort of haunting familiarity, and decided that they reminded one of the brittle globule in the meteor. Nahum plowed and sowed the 10-acre pasture and the upland lot, but did nothing with the land around the house. He knew it would be of no use, and hoped the summer's strange growths would draw all the poison from the soil. He was prepared for almost anything now, and had grown used to the sense of something near him, waiting to be heard. The shunning of his house by neighbors told on him, of course, but it told on his wife more. The boys were better off being at school each day, but they could not help being frightened by the gossip. Thaddeus, an especially sensitive youth, suffered the most. In May, the insects came, and Nahum's place became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. Most of the creatures seemed not quite usual in their aspects and motions, and their nocturnal habits contradicted all former experience. The gardeners took to watching at night, watching in all directions at random for something. They could not tell what. It was then that they owned that Thaddeus had been right about the trees. Mrs. Gardner was next to see it from the window as she watched the swollen boughs of a maple against a moonlit sky. The boughs surely moved, and there was no wind. It must be the sap. Strangeness had come into everything growing now, yet it was none of Nahum's family at all who made the next discovery. Familiarity had dulled them, and what they could not see was glimpsed by a timid windmill salesman from Bolton, who drove by one night in ignorance of the country legends. What he told in Arkham was given a short paragraph in the Gazette, and it was there that all the farmers, Nahum included, saw it first. The night had been dark, and the buggy lamps faint, but around a farm in the valley which everyone knew from the account must be Nahum's, the darkness had been less thick. A dim, though distinct luminosity seemed to inhere in all the vegetation, grass, leaves, and blossoms alike, while at one moment a detached piece of the phosphorescence appeared to stir furtively in the yard near the barn. The grass had so far seemed untouched, and the cows were freely pastured in the lot near the house, but toward the end of May the milk began to be bad. Then Nahum had the cows driven to the uplands, after which this trouble ceased. Not long after this, the change in grass and leaves became apparent to the eye. All the verdure was going gray, and was developing a highly singular quality of brittleness. Amy was now the only person who ever visited the place, and his visits were becoming fewer and fewer. When school closed, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Amy do their errands in town. They were failing curiously both physically and mentally, and no one was surprised when the news of Mrs. Gardner's madness stole around. It happened in June, about the anniversary of the meteor's fall, and the poor woman screamed about things in the air which she could not describe. In her raving there was not a single specific noun, but only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and ears tingled to impulses which were not wholly sounds. Something was taken away. She was being drained of something. Something was fastening itself on her that ought not to be. Someone must make it keep off. Nothing was ever still in the night. The walls and windows shifted. Nahum did not send her to the county asylum, but let her wander about the house as long as she was harmless to herself and others. Even when her expression changed, he did nothing. But when the boys grew afraid of her, when Thaddeus nearly fainted at the way she made faces at him, he decided to keep her locked in the attic. By July, she had ceased to speak and crawled on all fours. And before that month was over, Nahum got the mad notion that she was slightly luminous in the dark, as he now clearly saw was the case with the nearby vegetation. It was a little before this that the horses had stampeded. Something had aroused them in the night, and their neighing and kicking in their stalls had been terrible. There seemed virtually nothing to do to calm them, and when Nahum opened the stable door, they all bolted out like frightened woodland deer. It took a week to track all four, and when found, they were seen to be quite useless and unmanageable. Something had snapped in their brains, and each one had to be shot for its own good. Nahum borrowed a horse from Amy for his haying, but found it would not approach the barn. It shied, balked, and whinnied, and in the end he could do nothing but drive it into the yard while the men used their own strength to get the heavy wagon near enough the hayloft for convenient pitching. And, all the while, the vegetation was turning gray and brittle. Even the flowers, whose hues had been so strange, were graying now, and the fruit was coming out gray and dwarfed and tasteless. The asters and goldenrod bloomed gray and distorted, and the roses and zinnias and hollyhocks in the front yard were such blasphemous-looking things that Nahum's oldest boy, Zenis, cut them down. The strangely puffed insects died about that time. Even the bees had left their hives and taken to the woods. By September, all the vegetation was fast crumbling to a grayish powder, and Nahum feared that the trees would die before the poison was out of the soil. His wife now had spells of terrific screaming, and he and the boys were in a constant state of nervous tension. They shunned people now, and when school opened, the boys did not go. But it was Amy, on one of his rare visits, who first realized that the well water was no longer good. It had an evil taste that was not exactly fetid, nor exactly salty, and Amy advised his friend to dig another well on higher ground until the soil was good again. Nahum, however, ignored the warning, for he had by that time become callous to strange and unpleasant things. He and the boys continued to use the tainted supply, drinking it as listlessly and mechanically as they ate their meager and ill-cooked meals, and did their thankless and monotonous chores through the aimless days. There was something of stolid resignation about them all, as if they walked half in another world, between lines of nameless guards to a certain and familiar doom. Thaddeus went mad in September after a visit to the well. He had gone with a pail and had come back empty-handed, shrieking and waving his arms, and sometimes lapsing into a inane titter or whisper about the moving colors down there. 2 in one family was pretty bad, but Nahum was very brave about it. He let the boy run about for a week until he began stumbling and hurting himself, and then he shut him in an attic room across the hall from his mother's. The way they screamed at each other from behind their locked doors was very terrible, especially to little Merwin, who fancied they talked in some terrible language that was not of Earth. Merwin was getting frightfully imaginative, and his restlessness was worse after the shutting away of the brother who had been his greatest playmate. Almost at the same time, the mortality among the livestock commenced. Poultry turned grayish and died very quickly, and their meat being found dry and noisome upon cutting. Hogs grew inordinately fat, then suddenly began to undergo loathsome changes which no one could explain. Their meat was of course useless, and Nahum was at his wits' end. No rural veterinary would approach his place, and the city veterinary from Arkham was openly baffled. The swine began growing gray and brittle and falling to pieces before they died, and their eyes and muzzles developed singular alterations. It was very inexplicable, for they had never been fed from the tainted vegetation. Then, something struck the cows. Certain areas, or sometimes the whole body, would be uncannily shriveled or compressed, and atrocious collapses or disintegrations were common. In the last stages, and death was always the result, there would be a graying and turning brittle, like that which beset the hogs. There could be no question of poison, for all the cases occurred in a locked and undisturbed barn. No bites of prowling things could have brought the virus, for what live beast of earth can pass through solid obstacles? It must be only natural disease, yet what disease could wreak such results was beyond any mind's guessing. When the harvest came, there was not an animal surviving on the place, for the stock and poultry were dead, and the dogs had run away. These dogs, 3 in number, had all vanished one night, and were never heard of again. The 5 cats had left some time before, but their going was scarcely noticed since there now seemed to be no mice, and only Mrs. Gardner had made pets of the graceful felines. On the 19th of October, Nahum staggered into Amy's house with hideous news. The death had come to poor Thaddeus in his attic room, and it had come in a way which could not be told. Nahum had dug a grave in the railed family plot behind the farm, and had put therein what he found. There could have been nothing from outside, for the small barred window and locked door were intact, but it was much as it had been in the barn. Amy and his wife consoled the stricken man as best they could, but shuddered as they did so. Stark terror seemed to cling round the Gardners and all they touched, and the very presence of one in the house was a breath from regions unnamed and unnameable. Amy accompanied Nahum home with the greatest reluctance, and did what he might to calm the hysterical sobbing of little Merwin. Zenas needed no calming. He had come of late to do nothing but stare into space and obey what his father told him, and Amy thought that his fate was very merciful. Now and then Merwin's screams were answered faintly from the attic, and in response to an inquiring look, Nahum said that his wife was getting very feeble. When night approached, Amy managed to get away, for not even friendship could make him stay in that spot when the faint glow of vegetation began, and the trees may or may not have swayed without wind. It was really lucky for Amy that he was not more imaginative. Even as things were, his mind was bent ever so slightly. But had he been able to connect and reflect upon all the portents around him, he must inevitably have turned a total maniac. In the twilight he hastened home, the screams of the mad woman and the nervous child ringing horribly in his ears. 3 days later, Nahum burst into Amy's kitchen in the early morning, and in the absence of his host, stammered out a desperate tale once more, while Mrs. Pierce listened in a clutching fright. It was little Merwin this time. He was gone. He had gone out late at night with a lantern and pail for water, and had never come back. He had been going to pieces for days, and hardly knew what he was about. Screamed at everything. There had been a frantic shriek from the yard then, but before the father could get to the door, the boy was gone. There was no glow from the lantern he had taken, and of the child himself, no trace. At the time, Nahum thought the lantern and pail were gone too, but when dawn came, and the man had plodded back from his all-night search of the woods and fields, he had found some very curious things near the well. There was a crushed and apparently somewhat melted mass of iron which had certainly been the lantern, while a bent handle and twisted iron hoops beside it, both half fused, seemed to hint at the remnants of the pail. That was all. Nahum was past imagining. Mrs. Pierce was blank, and Amy, when he had reached home and heard the tale, could give no guess. Merwin was gone, and there would be no use in telling the people around who shunned all gardeners now. No use either in telling the city people at Arkham who laughed at everything. Thad was gone, and now Merwin was gone. Something was creeping and creeping, and waiting to be seen and heard. Nahum would go soon, He wanted Amy to look after his wife and Zenas if they survived him. It must all be a judgment of some sort, though he could not fancy what for, since he had always walked uprightly in the Lord's ways so far as he knew. For over 2 years, Amy saw nothing of Nahum, and then, worried about what might have happened, he overcame his fears and paid the Gardner place a visit. There was no smoke from the great chimney, and for a moment, the visitor was apprehensive of the worst. The aspect of the whole farm was shocking. Grayish withered grass and leaves on the ground, vines falling in brittle wreckage from the archaic walls and gables, and great bare trees clawing up at the gray November sky with a studied malevolence which Amy could not but feel had come from some subtle change in the tilt of the branches. But Nahum was alive, after all. He was weak and lying on a couch in the low-ceiled kitchen, but perfectly conscious and able to give simple orders to Zenas. The room was deadly cold, and as Amy visibly shivered, the host shouted huskily to Zenas for more wood. Wood, indeed, was sorely needed, since the cavernous fireplace was unlit and empty, with a cloud of soot blowing about in the chill wind that came down the chimney. Presently, Nahum asked if the extra wood had made him any more comfortable, and then Amy saw what had happened. The stoutest cord had broken at last, and the hapless farmer's mind was proof against more sorrow. Questioning tactfully, Amy could get no clear data at all about the missing Zenas. In the well. He lives in the well," was all that the clouded father would say. Then there flashed across the visitor's mind a sudden thought of the mad wife, and he changed his line of inquiry. "Nabby?" "Why, here she is," was the surprised response of poor Nahum, and Amy soon saw that he must search for himself. Leaving the harmless babbler on the couch, he took the keys from their nail beside the door and climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. It was very close and noisome up there, and no sound could be heard from any direction. Of the 4 doors in sight, only one was locked, and on this he tried various keys of the ring he had taken. The 3rd key proved the right one, and after some fumbling, Amy threw open the low white door. It was quite dark inside, for the window was small and half obscured by the crude wooden bars, and Amy could see nothing at all on the wide planked floor. The stench was beyond enduring, and before proceeding further he had to retreat to another room and return with his lungs filled with breathable air. When he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. While he screamed, he thought a momentary cloud eclipsed the window, and a second later he felt himself brushed as if by some hateful current of vapor. Strange colors danced before his eyes, and had not a present horror numbed him, he would have thought of the globule in the meteor that the geologist's hammer had shattered, and of the morbid vegetation that had sprouted in the spring. As it was, he thought only of the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, and which all too clearly had shared the nameless fate of young Thaddeus and the livestock. But the terrible thing about the horror was that it very slowly and perceptibly moved as it continued to crumble. Amy would give me no added particulars of this scene, but the shape in the corner does not reappear in his tale as a moving object. There are things which cannot be mentioned, and what is done in common humanity is sometimes cruelly judged by the law. I gather that no moving thing was left in that attic room, and that to leave anything capable of motion there would have been a deed so monstrous as to damn any accountable being to eternal torment. Anyone but a stolid farmer would have fainted or gone mad, but Amy walked conscious through that low doorway and locked the accursed secret behind him. There would be Nahum to deal with now, He must be fed and tended, and removed to some place where he could be cared for. Commencing his descent of the dark stairs, Amy heard a thud below him. He even thought a scream had been suddenly choked off, and recalled nervously the clammy vapor which had brushed by him in that frightful room above. What presence had his cry and entry started up? Halted by some vague fear, he heard still further sounds below. Indubitably, there was a sort of heavy dragging, and a most detestably sticky noise as of some fiendish and unclean species of suction. With an associative sense goaded to feverish heights, he thought unaccountably of what he had seen upstairs. Good God! What eldritch dream world was this into which he had blundered? He dared move neither backward nor forward, but stood there, trembling, at the black curve of the boxed-in staircase. Every trifle of the scene burned itself into his brain. The sounds, the sense of dread, expectancy, the darkness, the steepness of the narrow step. Unmerciful heaven! The faint but unmistakable luminosity of all the woodwork in sight, steps, sides, exposed lathes and beams alike. Then there burst forth a frantic whinny from Amy's horse outside, followed at once by a clatter which told of a frenzied runaway. In another moment, horse and buggy had gone beyond earshot, leaving the frightened man on the dark stairs to guess what had sent them. But that was not all. There had been another sound out there, a sort of liquid splash. Water. It must have been the well. He had left Hero untied near it, and a buggy wheel must have brushed the coping and knocked in a stone. And still the pale phosphorescence glowed in that detestably ancient woodwork. God, how old the house was. Most of it built before 1670, and the gambrel roof no later than 1730. A feeble scratching on the floor downstairs now sounded distinctly, and Amy's grip tightened on a heavy stick he had picked up in the attic for some purpose. Slowly nerving himself, he finished his descent and walked boldly toward the kitchen. But he did not complete the walk because what he sought was no longer there. It had come to meet him, and it was still alive after a fashion. Whether it had crawled or whether it had been dragged by any external forces, Amy could not say, but the death had been at it. Everything had happened in the last half hour, but collapse, graying, and disintegration were already far advanced. There was a horrible brittleness, and dry fragments were scaling off. Amy could not touch it, but looked horrifiedly into the distorted parody that had been a face. What was it, Nahum? What was it? He whispered, and the cleft, bulging lips were just able to crackle out a final answer. Nothing. Nothing. The color, it burns. Cold and wet. But it burns. It lived in the well. I seen it. I kinda smoke. Just like the flowers last spring. The well shone at night. Thad and Merwin and Zenith. Everything alive, sucking the life out of everything. In that stone. Must have come in that stone and poisoned the whole place. Don't know what it was, that round thing the men from the college dug out of the stone. They smashed it. It were the same color. Just the same. Like the flowers and the plants. Must have been more of them. Seeds, they growed. I seen it the first time this week. Must have got strong on Zenith. He was a big boy, full of life. It beats down your mind, and then it gets you. Burns you up. And the well water, you was right about that. It's evil water. Zenith never came back from the well. Can't get away. Draws you. You know something's coming, but tain't no use. I seen it time and again since Zenith was took. Oh, where's Nabby, Hammy? My head's no good. I don't know how long since I fed her. It'll get her if we ain't careful. Just a color. Her face is getting to have that color sometimes towards night. And it burns and sucks. It come from some place where things ain't as they is here. One of them professors said so. He was right. Oh. Look out, Emmy. It'll do something more. Sucks the life out. But that was all. That which spoke could speak no more because it had completely caved in. Amy laid a red-checked tablecloth over what was left and reeled out the back door into the fields. He climbed the slope to the 10-acre pasture and stumbled home by the north road and the woods. He could not pass that well from which his horses had run away. They had looked at it through the window and had seen that no stone was missing from the rim. Then, the lurching buggy had not dislodged anything after all. The splash had been something else. Something which went into the well after it had done with poor Nahum. When Amy reached his house, the horses and buggy had arrived before him and thrown his wife into fits of anxiety. Reassuring her without explanations, he set out at once for Arkham and notified the authorities that the Gardner family was no more. He indulged in no details, but merely told of the deaths of Nahum and Nabby, that of Thaddeus being already known, and mentioned that the cause seemed to be the same strange ailment which had killed the livestock. He also stated that Merwin and Zenith had disappeared. There was considerable questioning at the police station, and in the end, Amy was compelled to take 3 officers to the Gardner farm, together with the coroner, the medical examiner, and the veterinary who had treated the diseased animals. He went much against his will, for the afternoon was advancing and he feared the fall of night over that accursed place. But it was some comfort to have so many people with him. The 6 men drove out in a Democrat wagon, following Amy's buggy, and arrived at the pest-ridden farmhouse about 4 o'clock. Used as the officers were to gruesome experiences, not one remained unmoved at what was found in the attic and under the red-checked tablecloth on the floor below. The whole aspect of the farm, with its gray desolation, was terrible enough. But those 2 crumbling objects were beyond all bounds. No one could look at them, and even the medical examiner admitted that there was very little to examine. Specimens could be analyzed, of course, so he busied himself in obtaining them. And here it develops that a very puzzling aftermath occurred at the college laboratory, where the 2 vials of dust were finally taken. Under the spectroscope, both samples gave off an unknown spectrum, in which many of the baffling bands were precisely like those which the strange meteor had yielded in the previous year. The property of emitting this spectrum vanished in a month, the dust thereafter consisting mainly of alkaline phosphates and carbonates. Amy would not have told the men about the well if he had thought they meant to do anything then and there. It was getting towards sunset, and he was anxious to be away. But he could not help glancing nervously at the stony curb by the great sweep. And when a detective questioned him, he admitted that Nahum had feared something down there so much so that he had never even thought of searching it for Merwin or Zenas. After that, nothing would do but that they empty and explore the well immediately, so Amy had to wait trembling while pail after pail of rank water was hauled up and splashed on the soaking ground outside. The men sniffed in disgust at the fluid, and toward the last held their noses against the fetor they were uncovering. It was not so long a job as they had feared it would be, since the water was phenomenally low. There is no need to speak to exactly of what they found. Merwin and Zenas were both there, in part, though the vestiges were mainly skeletal. There were also a small deer and a large dog in about the same state, and a number of bones of small animals. The ooze and slime at the bottom seemed inexplicably porous and bubbling, and a man who descended on handholds with a long pole found that he could sink the wooden shaft to any depth in the mud of the floor without meeting any solid obstruction. Twilight had now fallen, and lanterns were brought from the house. Then, when it was seen that nothing further could be gained from the well, everyone went indoors and conferred in the ancient sitting room while the intermittent light of a spectral half-moon played wanly on the gray desolation outside. The men were frankly nonplussed by the entire case and could find no convincing common element to link the strange vegetable conditions, the unknown disease of livestock and humans, and the unaccountable deaths of Merwin and Zenas in the tainted well. They had heard the common country talk, it is true, but could not believe that anything contrary to natural law had occurred. No doubt the meteor had poisoned the soil, but the illness of persons and animals who had eaten nothing grown in that soil was another matter. Was it the well water? Very possibly. It might be a good idea to analyze it, but what peculiar madness could have made both boys jump into the well? Their deeds were so similar, and the fragments showed that they had both suffered from the gray, brittle death. Why was everything so gray and brittle? It was the coroner, seated near a window overlooking the yard, who first noticed the glow about the well. Night had finally set in, and all the abhorrent ground seemed faintly luminous with more than the fitful moonbeams. But this new glow was something definite and distinct, and appeared to shoot up from the black pit like a softened ray from a searchlight, giving dull reflections in the little ground pools where the water had been emptied. It had a very queer color, and as all the men clustered round the window, Amy gave a violent start. For this strange beam of ghastly miasma was to him of no unfamiliar hue. He had seen that color before, and feared to think what it might mean. He had seen it in the nasty, brittle globule in that aerolite 2 summers ago, had seen it in the crazy vegetation of the springtime, and had thought he had seen it for an instant that very morning against the small barred window of that terrible attic room where nameless things had happened. It had flashed there a second, and a clammy and hateful current of vapor had brushed past him. And then, poor Nahum had been taken by something of that color. He had said so at last, said it was like the globule and the plants. After that had come the runaway in the yard, and the splash in the well, and now that well was belching forth to the night a pale, insidious beam of the same demoniac tint. It does credit to the alertness of Amy's mind that he puzzled even at that tense moment over a point which was essentially scientific. He could not but wonder at his gleaning of the same impression from a vapor glimpsed in the daytime against a window opening on the morning sky, and from a nocturnal exhalation seen as a phosphorescent mist against the black and blasted landscape. It wasn't right. It was against nature, and he thought of those terrible last words of his stricken friend. "It come from some place where things aren't as they is here. One of them professors said so." All 3 horses outside, tied to a pair of shriveled saplings by the road, were now neighing and pawing frantically. The wagon driver startled for the door to do something, but Amy laid a shaky hand on his shoulder. "Don't go out there," he whispered. "There's more to this nor we know. Nahum said something lived in the well that sucks your life out. He said it must be something growed from a round ball like one we saw and seen that meteor stone what fell a year ago June. Sucks and burns, he said, and it's just a cloud of color, like that light out there now, that you can hardly see and can't tell what it is. Nahum thought it feeds on everything living and gets stronger all the time. He said he's seen it this last week. Must be something from a way off in the sky, like the men from the college last year says the meteor stone was. The way it's made and the way it works ain't like no way of God's world. It's something from beyond." So, the men paused indecisively as the light from the well grew stronger, and the hitched horses pawed and whinnied in increasing frenzy. It was truly an awful moment, with terror in that ancient and accursed house itself. 4 monstrous sets of fragments, 2 from the house and 2 from the well and the woodshed behind, and that shaft of unknown and unholy iridescence from the slimy depths in front. Amy had restrained the driver on impulse, forgetting how uninjured he himself was after the clammy brushing of that colored vapor in the attic room. But perhaps it is just as well that he acted as he did. No one will ever know what was abroad that night, and though the blasphemy from beyond had not so far hurt any human of unweakened mind, there is no telling what it might not have done at that last moment, and with its seemingly increased strength and the special signs of purpose it was soon to display beneath the half-clouded moonlit sky. All at once, one of the detectives at the window gave a short, sharp gasp. The others looked at him, and then quickly followed his own gaze upward to the point at which its idle straying had been suddenly arrested. There was no need for words. What had been disputed in country gossip was disputable no longer, and it is because of the thing which every man of that party agreed in whispering later on, that the strange days are never talked about in Arkham. It is necessary to premise that there was no wind at that hour of the evening. One did arise not long afterward, but there was absolutely none then. Even the dry tips of the lingering hedge mustard, gray and blighted, and the fringe on the roof of the standing Democrat wagon were unstirred. And yet, amid that tense, godless calm, the high bare boughs of all the trees in the yard were moving. They were twitching morbidly and spasmodically, clawing in convulsive and epileptic madness at the moonlit clouds, scratching impotently in the noxious air, as if jerked by some allied and bodiless line of linkage with subterranean horrors writhing and struggling below the black roots. Not a man breathed for several seconds. Then, a cloud of darker depth passed over the moon, and the silhouette of clutching branches faded out momentarily. At this, there was a general cry, muffled with awe but husky, and almost identical from every throat, for the terror had not faded with the silhouette, and in a fearsome instant of deeper darkness, the watcher saw wriggling at that treetop height 1,000 tiny points of faint and unhallowed radiance, tipping each bough like the fire of St. Elmo, were the flames that come down on the apostles' heads at Pentecost. It was a monstrous constellation of unnatural light, like a glutted swarm of corpse-fed fireflies dancing hellish sarabands over an accursed marsh, and its color was that same nameless intrusion which Amy had come to recognize and dread. All the while, the shaft of phosphorescence from the well was getting brighter and brighter, bringing to the minds of the huddled men a sense of doom and abnormality which far outtraced any image their conscious minds could form. It was no longer shining out. It was pouring out. And as the shapeless stream of unplaceable color left the well, it seemed to flow directly into the sky. The veterinary shivered and walked to the front door to drop the heavy extra bar across it. Amy shook no less, and had to tug and point for lack of controllable voice when he wished to draw notice to the growing luminosity of the trees. The neighing and stamping of the horses had become utterly frightful, but not a soul of that group in the old house would have ventured forth for any earthly reward. With the moments, the shining of the trees increased, while their restless branches seemed to strain more and more toward verticality. The wood of the well sweep was shining now, and presently a policeman dumbly pointed to some wooden sheds and beehives near the stone wall in the west. They were commencing to shine too, though the tethered vehicles of the visitors seemed so far unaffected. Then there was a wild commotion and clopping in the road, and as Amy quenched the lamp for better seeing, they realized that the span of frantic grays had broken their sapling and run off with the Democrat wagon. The shock served to loosen several tongues, and embarrassed whispers were exchanged. "It spreads on everything organic that's been round here," muttered the medical examiner. No one replied, but the man who had been in the well gave a hint that his long pole must have stirred up something intangible. "It was awful," he added. "There were no bottom at all, just ooze and bubbles, and the feeling of something lurking under there." Amy's horse still pawed and screamed deafeningly in the road outside, and nearly drowned its owner's faint quaver as he mumbled his formless reflections. "It come from that stone. It growed down there. Got everything living. Fed itself on 'em, mind and body. Had and Merwin and Zenis and Nabby. Nahum was the last. They all drunk the water. It got strong on 'em. It come from beyond, where things ain't like they be here. Now, it's gone home." At this point, as the column of unknown color flared suddenly stronger and began to weave itself into fantastic suggestions of shape, which each spectator described differently, there came from poor tethered hero such a sound as no man before or since ever heard from a horse. Every person in that low-pitched sitting room stopped his ears, and Amy turned away from the window in horror and nausea. Words could not convey it. When Amy looked out again, the hapless beast lay huddled inert on the moonlit ground, between the splintered shafts of the buggy. That was the last of Hero, till they buried him next day. But the present was no time to mourn, for almost at this instant a detective silently called attention to something terrible in the very room with them. In the absence of the lamplight, it was clear that a faint phosphorescence had begun to pervade the entire apartment. It glowed on the broad planked floor and the fragment of rag carpet, and shimmered over the sashes of the small paned windows. It ran up and down the exposed corner posts, coruscated about the shelf and mantel, and infected the very doors and furniture. Each minute saw it strengthen, and at last it was very plain that healthy living things must leave that house. Amy showed them the back door and the path up through the fields to the 10-acre pasture, They walked and stumbled as in a dream, and did not dare look back till they were far away on the high ground. They were glad of the path, for they could not have gone the front way, by that well. It was bad enough passing the glowing barn and sheds and those shining orchard trees with their gnarled, fiendish contours, but thank heaven the branches did their worst twisting high up. The moon went under some very black clouds as they crossed the rustic bridge over Chapman's Brook, and it was blind groping from there to the open meadows. When they looked back toward the valley and the distant Gardner place at the bottom, they saw a fearsome sight. At the farm was shining with a hideous, unknown blend of color, trees, buildings, and even such grass and herbage as had not been wholly changed to lethal gray brittleness. The boughs were all straining skyward, tipped with tongues of foul flame, and lambent tricklings of the same monstrous fire were creeping about the ridgepoles of the house, barn, and sheds. It was a scene from a vision of Fuseli, and over all the rest reigned that riot of luminous amorphousness, that alien and undimensioned rainbow of cryptic poison from the well, seething, feeling, lapping, reaching, scintillating, straining, and malignly bubbling in its cosmic and unrecognizable chromaticism. Then, without warning, the hideous thing shot vertically up toward the sky like a rocket or meteor, leaving behind no trail, and disappearing through a round and curiously regular hole in the clouds before any man could gasp or cry out. No watcher can ever forget that sight, and Amy stared blankly at the stars of Cygnus, Deneb twinkling above the others, where the unknown color had melted into the Milky Way. But his gaze was the next moment called swiftly to earth by the crackling in the valley. It was just that, only a wooden ripping and crackling, and not an explosion, as so many others of the party vowed. Yet the outcome was the same, for in one feverish kaleidoscopic instant there burst up from that doomed and accursed farm a gleamingly eruptive cataclysm of unnatural sparks and substance, blurring the glance of the few who saw it, and sending forth to the zenith a bombarding cloudburst of such colored and fantastic fragments as our universe must needs disown. Through quickly reclosing vapors they followed the great morbidity that had vanished, and in another second they had vanished too. Behind and below was only a darkness, to which men dared not return, and all about was a mounting wind which seemed to sweep down in black frore gusts from interstellar space. It shrieked and howled, and lashed the fields and distorted woods in a mad cosmic frenzy, till soon the trembling party realized it would be no use waiting for the moon to show what was left down there at Nahum's. Too awed even to hint theories, the 7 shaking men trudged back toward Arkham by the North Road. Amy was worse than his fellows, and begged them to see him inside his own kitchen, instead of keeping straight on to town. He did not wish to cross the blighted wind-whipped woods alone to his home on the main road, for he had an added shock that the others were spared, and was crushed forever with a brooding fear he dared not even mention for many years to come. As the rest of the watchers on that tempestuous hill had stolidly set their faces toward the road, Amy had looked back an instant at the shadowed valley of desolation so lately sheltering his ill-starred friend, and from that stricken, faraway spot, he had seen something feebly rise, only to sink down again upon the place from which the great, shapeless horror had shot into the sky. It was just a color, but not any color of earth or heavens. And because Amy recognized that color, and knew that this last faint remnant must still lurk down there in the well, he has never been quite right since. Amy would never go near the place again. It is 44 years now since the horror happened, but he has never been there, and will be glad when the new reservoir blots it out. I shall be glad too, for I do not like the way the sunlight changed color around the mouth of that abandoned well I passed. I hope the water will always be very deep, but even so, I shall never drink it. I do not think I shall visit the Arkham country hereafter. 3 of the men who had been with Amy returned the next morning to see the ruins by daylight, but there were not any real ruins, only the bricks of the chimney, the stones of the cellar, some mineral and metallic litter here and there, and the rim of that nefandous well. Save for Amy's dead horse, which they towed away and buried, and the buggy which they shortly returned to him, everything that had been living had gone. 5 eldritch acres of dusty gray desert remained, nor has anything ever grown there since. To this day it sprawls open to the sky like a great spot, eaten by acid in the woods and fields, and the few who have ever dared glimpse it in spite of the rural tales have named it the Blasted Heath. The rural tales are queer. They might be even queerer if city men and college chemists could be interested enough to analyze the water from that disused well, or the gray dust that no wind seems to disperse. Botanists, too, want to study the stunted flora on the borders of that spot, for they might shed light on the country notion that the blight is spreading, little by little, perhaps an inch a year. People say the color of the neighboring herbage is not quite right in the spring, and that wild things leave queer prints in the light winter snow. Snow never seems so heavy on the Blasted Heath as it is elsewhere. Horses, the few that are left in this motor age, grow skittish in the silent valley, and hunters cannot depend on their dogs too near the splotch of grayish dust. They say the mental influences are very bad too. Numbers went queer in the years after Nahum's taking, and always they lacked the power to get away. Then the stronger-minded folk all left the region, and only the foreigners tried to live in the crumbling old homesteads. They could not stay, though, and one sometimes wonders what insight beyond ours their wild, weird stories of whispered magic have given them. Their dreams at night, they protest, are very horrible in that grotesque country, and surely the very look of the dark realm is enough to stir a morbid fancy. No traveler has ever escaped a sense of strangeness in those deep ravines, and artists shiver as they paint thick woods, whose mystery is as much of the spirits as of the eye. I myself am curious about the sensation I derived from my one lone walk before Amy told me his tale. When twilight came, I had vaguely wished some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the deep sky voids above had crept into my soul. Do not ask me for my opinion. I do not know, that is all. There was no one but Amy to question, for Arkham people will not talk about the strange days, and all 3 professors who saw the aerolite in its colored globule are dead. There were other globules. Depend upon that. One must have fed itself and escaped, and probably there was another which was too late. No doubt it is still down the well. I know there was something wrong with the sunlight I saw above that miasmal brink. The rustics say the blight creeps an inch a year, so perhaps there is a kind of growth or nourishment even now. But whatever demon hatchling is there, it must be tethered to something, or else it would quickly spread. Is it fastened to the roots of those trees that claw the air? One of the current Arkham tales is about fat oaks that shine and move as they ought not to do at night. What it is, only God knows. In terms of matter, I suppose the thing Amy described would be called a gas. But this gas obeyed the laws that are not of our cosmos. This was no fruit of such worlds and suns as shine on the telescopes and photographic plates of our observatories. This was no breath from the skies whose motions and dimensions our astronomers measure, or deem too vast to measure. It was just a color, out of space, a frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinity, beyond all nature as we know it, from realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with the black extra-cosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. I doubt very much if Amy consciously lied to me, and I do not think his tale was all a freak of madness as the townsfolk had forewarned. Something terrible came to the hills and valleys on that meteor, and something terrible, though I know not in what proportion, still remains. I shall be glad to see the water come. Meanwhile, I hope nothing will happen to Amy. He saw so much of the thing, and its influence was so insidious. Why has he never been able to move away? How clearly he recalled those dying words of Nahum's. Can't get away. Drowsy. You know something's coming, but 'tain't no use. Amy's such a good old man. When the Reservoir Gang gets to work, I must write the chief engineer to keep a sharp watch on him. I would hate to think of him as the gray, twisted, brittle monstrosity, which persists more and more in troubling my sleep.
William Harrow stood at the front of the modest off-white skiff as it lurched forward, constantly battered, lifting and crashing back down again with the swelling tide. He didn't move, looking onward with one hand raised to his shaped, serious brow in a near salute through a particularly wet and noxious low mist. Hush Isle, once just an uncertain black shape lost in the fog, gradually came into view, changing its form into something rather gaunt and unsightly. There was no sand there. There was no proper beach. The base of the small island was composed entirely of unwieldy, sharp black rocks that sputtered stiffly in the gray winter bloom. Behind him, his wife Eleanor and 6-year-old daughter Rose scuttled about, laughing in the cold, open air and running their hands through the choppy current. Now and then one of them would squeal or gasp as the icy water rushed upward and met them, slashing at the sides of the skiff and spraying them in the face and hair. He didn't notice them. He didn't even look back. He thought he had seen something in the dreary morning haze as they pressed on through the turbulence. A reflection of an old man, distorted black and blue, bloated and warped by weeks of attrition and brine, picked apart by crabs, devoured by thousands of hideous, scuttling, slimy creatures from the depths. He looked steadily on through the spray as what appeared to be a ghastly jaw distended, cracked, and then unhinged entirely, as impossibly long, tendril-like fingers wormed out of his mouth. The bitter, bleak salt air nipped at Eleanor's face as she smiled at her daughter. She didn't mind. She almost couldn't feel it. She was enjoying herself for the first time in many weeks. She felt like a child again. She felt like her daughter. She cherished being out in nature, away from the city, away from the people she knew, her usual thoughtless routine,
It all felt rather suffocating, ceaseless, and unbearable, as if she would be moving the same way, in the same familiar circles for the rest of her life. In her mind, she often transported herself to this very place, or somewhere quite similar, away from it all, cast aside at sea, where the fragrant frosted air tasted wild and brackish, and anything seemed possible. A tall wave collided harshly with the front of the skiff, knocking Rose with a giggle from her crouched position onto her backside. It didn't move her husband. Eleanor didn't believe that anything did anymore.
Careful, girls.
The gruff elderly man who sat between them warned as he continued to row, flashing a tense wolf-like yellow-toothed grin that extended well up and beyond his beady black eyes.
You can't trust the water.
Often Eleanor would have been bothered by his off-putting starved gaze, or by the way he hissed girls from between his crooked teeth, but today she couldn't care less. She did feel like a girl just then. Rose had never seen an island so ugly in her whole life. She had pictured it quite differently when her parents had told her that they would be going on the trip to a secluded island earlier in the week. In her mind, it was a lovely place with rolling pristine beaches full of seashells for her to collect, an ice cream parlor just off the sand with her favorite mint chocolate chip, and lofty, vibrantly red lifeguard posts like she saw in the movies. This was all very different. The place was morose and brooding, both grand and sunken in places, and much smaller than she envisioned. She could see across the entire island, even with the heavy fog that crowded them. She saw mangled rows of windswept and tattered trees. She saw the house, too, stained gray and singular, standing alone in the center of the island, rising above them like some huge shingled skeleton peering down. She saw something glint in the corner of her eye, and chanced to look over the railing. Two bright, hollow orbs hung in the water, seemingly moving alongside the boat. They flashed once and disappeared. Rose thought they looked remarkably like eyes. There were 2 miles of frothing crude sea between the mainland and where they now stood. The ungainly, jagged rocks and jutting, spindly grasses that formed something of a malformed path leading up to the house. William thought it quite handsome in a way, towering and dark, rigid and angular. Something about it agreed with him, set him at ease, which is why he had brought them here in the first place. Work had been murder recently. The late nights, no sleep, weeks of travel with no appreciable end in sight. When he had heard about the place in that prickly old tavern down by the wharf, he immediately inquired about its availability. He didn't care what it cost him. He couldn't take another day in the city, in their cramped quarters, the neighbors, the same blank, falsely sociable, monotonous faces at the firm. It was enough to drive anyone mad. William reached down and plucked their luggage, 2 identically brown large duffels, one considerably heavier than the other from the wet stones, and started up the path winding upward toward the vacation residence, as his family trailed behind him. As they neared the front steps, which appeared just off in some way, built perhaps at an irregular degree, or so worn away by flood or flat gust that the same effect was achieved, he turned back to follow the tiny drab shape of the skiff as it hustled over steep waves and began to dissolve into the low light, swallowed whole by the immense curtains of damp, dark air. William felt relief as he lost all sense of the thing that he might never see the despicable little ship again. It was Eleanor who first noticed that something wasn't quite right about the place. A great somber darkness pressed up against the windows, and the front door, upon testing the handle, swung open freely with just a touch. A humid, sour stagnation greeted her at the door as they shuffled in, sniffing and shivering from the cold. It felt as if nothing had lived within the walls for some time. Still, Eleanor had the impression that there was something there, standing tall, with hidden eyes that scoured the three of them, just out of sight in the flood of shadows that washed through the entryway and yawning chasm of a corridor that stretched out much before them and into nothing. She found herself, against her usual prudence, swiping madly for the switch, and on finding it, raised it as quickly as possible, not wanting to spend another moment in the intolerable blackness. The light arrived lazily as the house groaned, bellowed, and stammered to life, filling the adjacent rooms and sweeping the halls with a markedly orange color, a burnt, almost reddish complexion. Eleanor glanced at her husband, feeling uneasy. He stood perfectly still as a playful grin carved up his face. Rose didn't like the baleful old house at all. She moved with her mother through the extended corridor past many broad cavernous rooms, each with a definite and distinct personality. There were countless oil portraits on the walls with utterly white, vacant faces, which leered down at her whenever she stared at any one space for too long. It reeked, too, an earthly putrid odor reminiscent of someone trying to conceal the corrosion of wasted fish. Upon inspection, Rose wasn't sure why they had come here at all, nor why her father had been so enthusiastic by the proposition in the first place. He never liked holidays, always finding a way to complain about the travel, the hotel service, or the expense. He wasn't an outwardly adventurous man, particularly as he grew older, but he had positively raved about the place for some days now, repeating a story that he had heard from some miserable old sea dog regarding the remarkable beauty and serenity of the place. Rose followed her mother through the ample kitchen with rough-appearing speckled tiles and a large assortment of well-worn copper pots hanging directly from the ceiling. She could hear her father's weighty steps as he crossed through the second story above, placing their luggage in the bedrooms. She heard doors opening and closing in the distance, something that sounded like muffled concern coming from just above her. And then, after a long silence, something else, too. She heard what she thought then must have been something very long and very heavy dragging itself along the carpet and onto the kitchen tiles. Rose was too afraid to look, too afraid to speak. Her left hand held her mother, and her right covered her eyes. William finished unloading the bags in the master chamber and the border in pink, plainly juvenile adjoining room. He began to advance through an unusually designed, nearly interwoven collection of vast, rather dreadful rooms, each positively filled to the brim with dusty relics, ragged leather cushions, and that constant stench of deterioration. The smell didn't bother him. He had known about it, welcomed it even, since his first visit to the house 3 weeks prior. He hadn't informed Ellen that he had come to stay here when he was supposed to be off on a commercial trip in Seattle. He had to be certain before he involved her. He had to see the place for himself, bricks and mortar, ensure that it was worth the time and effort of dragging her and the little beast way out into the country, then off into the depths of the ocean, where everything felt so final. He wanted also to prove with some degree of confidence that what the irritable old man with his darting recessed eyes and his parchment yellow sun-warped skin had said was true. To prove that his estate, which he had leased to William at quite an affordable rate, was indeed unique, alone in its isolation, perfect serenity, and appreciable quality. William smiled to himself. He found a large window that faced the back of the house, its once substantial courtyard and the vast overgrown pit that waited just beyond, circled desperately by dozens of spirited, paunchy seagulls that whooped, hollered, and plunged downward, jousting each other in the air. It was such a small thing, that deceit. Many men had done much worse than scouting the property in secret before they leased it for the holiday. Still, it bothered him then for the first time, and just for a moment, as he watched the waves rise and fall in the distance, heaving amongst themselves and against the shoreline, folding and unfolding, living and dying all over again. The song came then, the familiar quiet hum that came from just out of reach of conscious rational thought, the whirl and thrumming of strings, primal chords, and lyrics from much before he first drew breath in the world. His eyes wandered from the sea back to the chasm behind the house and lived there. Eleanor didn't notice that Rose had disappeared until she had wandered through most of the second story, crossing from one garish crimson or gold room to another, running her hands all too pleasantly along the tapered raised walls, listening to the stark silence. She had moved in something of a trance, scarcely aware that she was moving at all, or that those little fingers had once again held her so tightly, had simply shrugged off. Everything felt faint and surreal, but one thought rushed back with enough force to wrest her from obscurity. Rose. Eleanor called for her daughter, her voice rising to a necessary but otherwise unsuitable pitch, the distressed lament of a parent, deathly afraid for their little loved one, so vulnerable and unable to guide their way through the world. She listened as the sound carried up and away from her, driven down meandering corridors, and then simply seemed to dissipate entirely in the uncertain spaces beyond. She called for William. He didn't respond. White-hot panic leapt through her body and settled in the base of her throat, choking her. Something was terribly wrong. She knew it. She could sense it somehow. Something had been disorienting her while it stalked her daughter. A sudden powerful volley of rain thrashed against the long languished window to her left, and she spun to it immediately. There was a face there, washed by both sea and salt, callous skin folded unnaturally against itself, hollow blank eyes that looked through her entirely, never blinking. She watched in sheer terror as its awful mouth began to open, much too wide to be human, the decaying black lips pulling back like paper, rows of shattered teeth with it, and a long mutilated hand began to rip its way out of its throat. Eleanor screamed and ran from the horror, darting from the room and into the corridor, shouting for Rose, whom she loved more than anything in the world. Rose had seen the man too late. It had been the song that attracted her, sweet and low, barely audible, but pleasant in such a wholly indescribable way. It was as if the sound had been tailored just for her, so cheery and calming, something to set her mind at ease from whatever horrible thing she had heard slithering down the hallway just moments before. The song made that all wash away, made her release her grip on her mother's warm hand without even noticing that she did, and slip away into the parlor, with its high-coated wainscoting, heavy, dour curtains, an extensive collection of colorful sitting tables and ornaments. But it had stopped then just as it drew her away, just as her mother mounted the 20 or so steps upstairs, just as she heard the thing begin to slither again through the darkness towards her. Rose yelled, but the sound was squelched there, caught and consumed as if it had never existed. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, not thinking to look behind her until she crossed several rooms and found a cupboard nearly twice her size. She carefully squeezed the handles, hoping they wouldn't come undone. Much of the house seemed fragile, and stuffed herself inside, folding her legs uncomfortably beneath her to make herself fit. Her breath came in short, uneasy bursts as she tried to temper it to better listen for any sign of that vile thing in the passage. She did, after a while, hear the thing moving again, shuffling from expensive tile to diminishing carpet, making a sound that most reminded her of when she had seen and then heard a snake swiftly coiling itself up the white oak tree behind her elementary school. She looked through the gap between the shuttered wooden opening, forcing herself, unable to resist the urge while so miserably corralled in the tight space, and with that dreadful noise again upon her. It was a man, walking but not truly walking, more dragging himself through the hall and into her room. His eyes were completely white and flushed with something unfamiliar to her, a strange inhuman pale resonance. His face was horribly stretched and broken in places, crushed where something had been brought against his skull until it fractured and came away. His skin was purple and black, spotted with red blotchy patches and torn apart in places. She recognized his stench immediately. Clumps of long-dead seaweed decomposing in the sun, the very one she had first smelled upon arrival to the island, and with much more concentration in the interior spaces of the home. He began to squirm directly towards her, the hundreds of shattered pieces of his face clicking and moving all wrong as he neared the cupboard. Rose wanted to scream, to cry out for her mother, to hold her hands over her eyes and wish this awful thing away. But instead, she was silent. William reflected as he pushed his shovel through soil, earth, and old clay, of the fair face he had once called his own. Victoria, his first and most true love. They had met at university and spent the better part of 4 years together, the best of his life. Her soft, pale skin seemed to burn in his mind. Her bright, wide eyes followed him like a cat as he worked, displacing mounds of dirt and rock with each thrust. She was with him even now, though her shape wasn't quite certain and seemed to fade away into the mist at her closest edges. He loved her anyway. Loved her in a way in which he had never loved Eleanor or his spoiled daughter Rose. He loved her with parts of himself that had died off many years ago, when she had grown ill and died at 24. A terrible hollowness that had taken him, swept through his mind and body, and altered the rest of his life. Nothing was quite the same after that. No sugar as sweet, no success as pleasing. His marriage to Eleanor had come after some significant pressure from both families, and after he had been alone for many years. It was a disservice to Eleanor that he accepted the proposal, and he regretted it to this day. He began to drink shortly after the ceremony, hiding it at first and most ardently from his wife and the little brat who ran through his house, which he had worked so hard to maintain, breaking and destroying without a care in the world. His shovel hit something damp and tough, splitting it into two halves that squelched as it broke apart, and the inside splashed out. The foolish old man's skull, horrid and harrowed, besieged by salt and sea, the remaining flesh torn, picked over, and carried away by many hungry beaks and insects with dozens of spindly legs. The old man had served his purpose, if nothing else but to prove the validity of his own story, the senseless whisper that many years before settlers had traveled to Hush Isle to bury the recovered bones of their drowned sailors and children here, and wait for them to return with the tide. As the bleary old drunkard had relayed the story to him, William decided that he had to find out for himself either way. He had come to suicide just nights before. He had even fastened a wire around his neck and sat for hours in the parlor in front of the blaring television set, staring up at the ceiling fan as it turned and turned, as Eleanor and Rose slept soundly just a few feet above him. Even more unsettling was the discovery that he didn't mind how it felt, that cold metal cord, that he even might have welcomed it, wanted to feel that sudden rush of pressure snap his neck sideways and be done with it all. No more dues, No more formal meetings, no more quarterly reports, no more Eleanor, no more Rose. Instead, William had accepted the inebriated man's invitation to spend an evening with him at his ghastly property and see truly if there was some supernatural influence that made the place return the unliving just as they were. He felt it immediately upon reaching the shore, hearing the old words rising from the tide, from hundreds of voices. Heard the sweet siren song so gentle and enticing, telling him to kill, kill, kill. William listened. He grabbed the old drunk by the neck and throttled him where he stood, feeling his body exhale as it went limp, and the light faded from his sunken eyes. But that wasn't enough. He found the gardening shovel in the shed and crushed the man's skull in, swinging again and again until he lost all strength and collapsed beside the broken body, laughing and crying as the wind howled and black salt rain fell all around him. Then he saw her, Victoria, though just a shadow of herself, barely an outline in the dusk. She smiled and her warm eyes found him, as they had many years before. He felt well again, truly for the first time since her illness, as if everything mattered again, and the world could finally continue to spin on. Her voice was the same as he remembered it, delicate and honey-sweet, drifting in and out of the breeze, telling him that the old man wasn't enough, telling him that he would need 2 more. He knew what it would take to bring her back. William finished scraping away the filth and remnants of furrowed corpses, unfurled his pack, which he had set aside in his padded compartment of the luggage set, and spilled the bones of his lovely Victoria, whose body he had exhumed just yesterday. Rose burst from the cupboard as Eleanor raced through the halls calling her name and flung herself crying into her mother's arms. She held her daughter tightly for a moment and then began to search over her shoulder and all around her for signs of trouble.
What happened?
She asked.
Is everything okay? The bad man.
Rose started.
He's here. I saw him too.
Eleanor answered, feeling that they were still being watched from just around the corner.
We have to get out of here. We have to find your father.
Rose nodded and Eleanor kissed her on the forehead, looked her in the eyes and promised that she wouldn't lose her again. Then they stood together and hurried toward the front door, knowing without even speaking the words that they would rather chance the wailing, fervent squall outside than whatever waited inside the house. The rain was torrential, coming in huge, unrelenting drops, enveloping everything in darkness and brine. The wind came in great horizontal gusts, collapsing against Rose with enough vigor that it stung her skin. She clung to her mother more tightly than ever as they searched the grounds for her father, one step at a time, fighting the oncoming deluge. They found him some distance from the back of the house, silhouetted against a wall of ocean, a vague, murky shape just in the field of view. They ran together, quickly closing the distance to reunite their family. They couldn't see what William was holding until they were within a few feet of him. A shovel, drenched in grime and earth, dripping madly into the wide crater below him. Rose watched as her mother tensed up and stopped moving. She called to him.
What are you doing? We need help.
You always need something from me, don't you?
He said after a moment. His voice was vicious, more animal than human. He turned to her slowly, coiled muscles pressed against his drenched clothing, his thick black hair falling in long, wet strands all down his face, obscuring his eyes.
William, you're scaring me.
He didn't hesitate. He swung the shovel in a wide arc that connected with Eleanor's ribs, instantly splitting her skin and sending her flying backward from the impact onto the mud below. Rose screamed. Eleanor coughed and sputtered for breath, rolling on her back from the pain and loss of oxygen.
It has to be this way. It has to be both of you, so she can live.
He lifted the shovel again, higher this time, ready to bring it down against her skull, collapsing it, just as he had collapsed the old man. Rose didn't stop to think about what she was doing. She reached down to the displaced pile of debris and hurled a muddied stone, hitting him just above his brow and near his temple. William stumbled back and grabbed at his eye as blood gushed from the wound. Rose helped her mother get to her feet, and they ran back toward the hateful black titan of a house that loomed insanely above them. At first, William couldn't see out of his right eye where the little devil had hit him with the rock. Blood pooled and crept into his vision as pain exploded through his skull. By the time he had gathered himself, he could see the two of them rushing up the courtyard steps into the back of the house. He tasted his blood, letting it play with his teeth as he began to follow them, the shovel trailing behind him, clinking and clacking furiously off the ground as he heaved it along with his right arm. It didn't matter how far they ran. They had nowhere to go. Eleanor burst through the back doors, turning just long enough to bolt them behind her before they hurried onward. They couldn't stay in the house, that much she knew. He would catch them sooner or later, beating that rusted shovel endlessly against anything in the way until he reached them. He was lost in his eyes, utterly shattered. She had never seen anyone look like that before, as if nothing tethered him to the world anymore. Not pain, exhaustion, or any human empathy. It was a horrifying prospect, trapped here with her daughter and that wild, ferocious man she had once called her husband, who now would do anything to hurt them. She could hear him outside getting closer to the back door, the metallic clink of the shovel as it beat against the courtyard steps, and then awfully the shrill sound it made when it came through the adjacent glass window. She grabbed Rose's face and looked her in the eyes for the second time that night.
I need you to run down to the dock. I can draw him through the house, but you need to be waiting there when I come to you. Do you understand? I'm not going to leave you, Mom.
Rose cried, shaking her head in such a slight way that it broke Eleanor's heart.
I need you to look for a boat. Do you hear me? There must be something there. Anything. An emergency raft or something that you think can float.
Rose nodded, unable to find words.
I know this is very scary for you, but I need you right now.
Rose wiped at the tears in her eyes. She turned and ran past her mother and down the long hall that led to the front door. Eleanor called to her daughter one more time as she heard William finish smashing the glass and heard the heavy soles of his shoes contacting the creaking wood boards near the exit.
Don't come back, no matter what you hear.
Rose barely felt like a human anymore. Everything was happening much too fast and much too horribly for consideration. She sprinted as her mother had pleaded with her, first to the huge front door and then through it and back into the night. The sky was a worrisome black as she ran. Howling, shrieking rain came in scathing droves as she followed the worn, winding path back down the hill and toward the dock, where everything had seemed so different in the daylight. She thought she heard a scream at the house, but she didn't turn. She did what she promised. Suddenly she was at the dock, tripping on the boards but catching herself on one knee. She stood up grimacing, feeling very exhausted and very afraid, and began to comb the area. In the total blackness where it appeared somehow that not a single star shone in the sky, she couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, anything that resembled a boat or raft, or anything that could float past the first breach of the ocean. Rose heard another scream, a billowy, echoey screech that was carried through the wind, tossing and swirling until it came to her all wrong. She stared up at the house, bright red in its small windows. She jumped up and down in place, not knowing what to do. Just as she was about to go back to the house to help her mother, she saw the man again, distant and unmoving, his misshapen face and displaced jaw examining her from the corner of her vision. She wheeled about and nearly fell again. He seemed to nod for a moment and then began to fade. Beneath him was what appeared to be the edge of a ferry, sticking inelegantly out from a pile of mangled sticks and brambles. Rose ran to it, knowing that she had no time to waste, and began ripping at the wood, pulling and tearing anything in her way. She grabbed a hold of the wooden boards that made up the boat and pulled with everything she had, falling almost immediately into the wet, dark slop below. It didn't budge. She forced herself up and tried again, this time grunting and screaming with the effort. It budged, then came away entirely, and Rose flew backwards harder this time, nearly knocking herself unconscious from the impact. The boat, just large enough for a small person, or maybe two, began to slide slowly down toward her. Rose, using the last of her strength, stood again and grabbing the side, forced it to the edge of the dock and into the water, where she held it there, waiting. Frothy, vulgar sea flooded through the splintered window, spilling cruelly onto the wooden panels beneath, as William snarled and pulled himself through, sharp edges of glass tearing at his clothes, his skin, his flesh. He barely felt it anymore, and even then he felt more pleasure than pain. He could see them, all through the halls, inarticulate shapes peering through the surrounding darkness, the grinning dead faces of so many before him, so many who had come to the island before and died there, so many others who heard the music. It was all he could hear now, the thrumming, throbbing, pulsing beat, the siren song of the night, the infinite depths of the sea, pushing and worming through his mind until there was nothing left. Eleanor stripped her outer layers as she moved, wringing her jacket into a crumpled mess, squeezing the water onto the floor towards a room to her left, and throwing it into the shadows there. She did the same for her scarf and hat, which had been folded into itself and stuffed into a pocket. Anything she could lose, she did, tossing each into different rooms as she turned and doubled back the way she came. She hoped the trail would distract him, that he would be compelled to search each room, giving Rose precious seconds to find something that could serve as a lifeboat and take them away from this wretched, desolate place. She stopped near the edge of a kitchen entrance, where a kiss-to-cook apron was hanging from a misshapen brass hook, and putting her back against the wall, she dropped it to the ground and towed the water that had pooled underneath her. She forced herself to take long, slow breaths as she heard her husband begin to inspect each room, the heavy metal head of the shovel dragging ruthlessly off the hardwood floors, whacking against each crease and bump. She thought of her daughter out there in the dark, in the cold, in the rain, out there with whatever that foul creature was, clawing its way across the beach, and terror gripped her heart. She could hear William making noises as he approached, only a few rooms away now, skulking and clawing his way onward, grunting and howling strange words she had never heard before. A venerable sea shanty, something sung together, a celebratory merry melody. She thought that she could hear dozens of voices rising and falling with the man she had shared a home with for over a decade, a child, a life. A man who had rarely even raised his voice at her. She closed her eyes, steadying herself, as his heavy boots came closer, the swollen wood groaning and creasing under the weight of the man, who seemed then so much larger than he had ever been. Eleanor prayed that Rose had found something. She was out of time. Everything seemed to hesitate. The wind, the rain, the tide, the heavy steps, the insane shrieks from the man she loved. She threw herself forward and down just as his shovel hurled past her head and slammed into the wood and plaster there, connecting so violently that it embedded itself a full inch into the surface. She landed awkwardly on her hands and pushed up as quickly as she could, hearing the roaring, malicious bellow of the man just behind her as he wrenched the tool free. He swung again, somewhere just behind her head. She could feel the air hiss past her ear and whip through the back of her hair. She cried out, ducked on impulse, and flung herself out through the glass-paneled double doors and into the night. Rose watched as her mother came, surging and limping forward through the torrent, watched as her father chased, illuminated madly by the lurid red glow from the house, just steps behind her, screaming, chanting, singing, and laughing, all the time swinging that huge shovel like a turban in looping feral shifts. Rose kicked the skiff out into the waves just as her mother rounded the steps onto the dock. He was gaining ground on her, swinging down with the shovel, glancing off the right shoulder blade, nearly causing her mother to lose her balance. Instead, she pushed off with her right leg and flung herself forward and out, hanging in the air for a full second before collapsing bitterly onto the front of the boat, her legs partially submerged in the water. She howled in pain, and Rose rushed to her and helped pull her the rest of the way onto the deck. For just a moment they lay flat, blanketed in rain, gasping for air and crying together. Only the wind and the tide sounded then, beating mercilessly against the sides of the skiff, the dock, and the coast. William was silent. Eleanor and Rose forced themselves up to a seated position and searched the dock. He was there, standing still, his shirt ripped open, his wounds exposed and bleeding with the rain, his arms raised wide, up past his shoulders.
Ro!
Eleanor shouted into the vicious tempest, panic rising through her as she realized that something horrible was about to happen.
Ro!
They each grabbed the paddles, which had been fastened to the interior sides of the skiff, and began to chop at the waves as quickly as they could, timing with each other until they were in unison, beginning to put some distance between them and the beach. William didn't move. His arms stayed wide in some strange profane prayer, and they heard him roaring triumphantly into the night, his voice drifting unnaturally, a series of inhuman guttural grunts unlike anything they had ever known. Voices came from all around them, from the sea itself, at such a ferocious pitch and volume that both Rose and Eleanor grabbed their ears to shield them from the immense pain. The gale came even more ferociously then, alternating and spitting huge, treacherous waves careening over the sides of the boat, drowning, sinking them in the depths, where the tide embraced them and didn't let go. William took his time. He moved slowly, savoring it all. The brilliant wet air, the way the frost kicked up from the waves and lapped at his naked flesh, and the jumping, cheering, riotous music that danced with his mind. He found Eleanor strewn face down on the rocks, cast down like some plaything, a doll tossed aside and forgotten by a bored child, barely breathing, unconscious. He looked at her dispassionately, unbelieving then that he could ever have shared a bed with this pathetic creature. Rose washed up next to her, turning over with the water that carried her. Blood still dripped from the wound above his eye, leaking onto his family as he reached down, grabbed them by their long brown hair, and began to drag them to the pit. Eleanor thought she was dead, drowned in that infinite frozen sea, among the millions of long-lost and rotten things that lay waiting on the seafloor. At first, she couldn't feel anything at all, just a vague, peculiar sensation of movement, that she was being carried, no, pulled along the ground over sticks and stones, shells and soil, to where she couldn't say. Gradually, feeling returned to her, horrible as it was. Her whole body throbbed. It felt broken and unwieldy, nearly choked in the sea brine, hurled against the sandbar, smothered and collected there by the great heaves of nature. Her scalp was on fire. Her mind was dull and battered. When her eyes did open, fluttering once and filling with salt water, she wished she had died. She was staring down at the face of the dead man, his skin black and wet. Mold and decay wove their way through his exposed sinew, muscle, and yellow bone. His remains, all too twisted and curled, had been thrown into a wide gaping hole in the earth, a burial spot, a tomb, where he had laid for some time, eaten away by insects, birds, beasts, and the elements until only the most unsavory bits remained. She wanted to scream at the sight, but she couldn't find the strength. Her throat burned from where the salt water had infiltrated and filled her lungs. She wondered how she did live, how she could have survived such an ordeal, how the swells had grown so tall, twice the size they had just been, as William had chanted and screamed into the black void of night, some ancient, raw, ungodly worship. Rose. Eleanor forced herself from the edge of the pit, turning to her side, and breathed then longer when she saw her daughter, pallid and washed over but seemingly alive. She reached for her hand, weakly, touching her skin just for a moment, before Rose started to be hauled away again, and then hoisted onto her feet. William.
Leave her alone.
She tried to say, but the words didn't come.
God damn you, Will. Leave her alone.
Still nothing, only the delighted squeals of the wind as it savaged the beach and tore through unkempt grasses. Again the blackness. She could barely see his face, wicked and dark, contorted, no longer his own. Rose opened her eyes, and they grew wide with terror. She tried to squirm out of his grasp, but he held her firmly pinned to his chest, never moving except his lips, which twisted upward into a toothy sneer. William was holding something to her neck, one of the black rocks from the shore, sharp and serrated, with a curved tip. His eyes found Eleanor's as he pushed the angled tip of the hook into her flesh, beginning to break the skin.
No!
Eleanor shouted, shoving herself up into her feet with the last of her strength, her arms splayed warily out in front of her.
I never wanted either of you,
William said with a snarl.
Now I can finally live.
His hand twitched and pulled inward as he slashed at Rose's throat. Eleanor screamed. Just as William moved, the dead man flashed his huge, piercing, hollow eyes, appearing just inches from his face. He stepped back and slipped. His hand and the crooked black rock missed Rose, shifting upward and striking his throat. William dropped the stone and fell to his knees, pressing both hands against the wound and struggling to put pressure there. It wasn't enough. His blood ran free and fully through his fingers and down his front. His eyes were wide, bright, fearful for the first time since he had come to the heroin place. Eleanor rushed to her daughter and held her tight, pulling her away and burying her head into her chest. William began to dim. Choking on his own blood and losing strength, tipped forward and fell into the pit, uneasily colliding with the soil, broken bones, and spoiled tissue from many years of sacrifice, with a deflated wet thud. Eleanor held her daughter as the rain cascaded on them, and somewhere in the distance, the storm began to break. She looked up just once and found the eyes of the dead man. They didn't look so cruel anymore. When the sun came, Eleanor and Rose collected their things and moved silently back from the house to the dock. They waited there for the ferryman to return, which he did promptly at midday. They climbed into the boat without saying a word or nodding to greet the man. He didn't ask where William was. He didn't seem to care. Maybe he knew not to ask. He began to row slowly away from that loathsome place which looked so different by day, met with sloping shadows that slanted too far from the windswept trees, along water as calm and placid as if it had been land instead. Eleanor didn't look back, but Rose did, as the land began to shrink and then almost disappeared entirely into nothing. She saw hundreds of figures from many lives standing soundlessly on the shimmering black rocks. William stood alone.
Chilling tales for dark